recently, and you know, the Lehigh line is the place to be to see those. I just saw somebody flash up that the Catskill Mountain is not running Polar Express this year. I don't think anybody's running Polar Express. The fellow who owns the franchise, the Durango and Silverton, they're not doing any of them this year, to my knowledge. I forget the actual name of the corporation, but they do expect to be back in 2021. They've been, you know, so Morristown and Erie is keeping the franchise alive, or keeping the tradition alive, which is a good business move. We don't want things forgotten during the lockdowns, just like we don't want to do it with our tri-state meetings. That's why we're doing it this way, just to keep us all in touch. You know, we rail fans are social animals. So, and I do believe we're getting ready for the star of our show.
Yes, sir. The Facebook Live feed is started, and I think Richie's ready. So unless there are other, I don't see any other hands up or any other questions. So Rich, if you're ready, take it away.
Sure. Just before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge Tom Namath. So during our presentation, or plea for Raritan River 10 donations, Tom generously donated some funds. So thank you, Tom. Tom has given a number of tri-state presentations before, and we definitely appreciate the support.
Yes, thank you, Tom.
One brief postscript from Bill Shepard. Revolution Rail will be operating bicycles on the New Jersey Transit line at Cape May. So we can perhaps look into that a little bit further. And I think that's all we have from for the good of the club.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome aboard.
Okay, so here we go. So good evening, Tri-Staters, and thank you for I'm definitely humbled by the overwhelming attendance presentation tonight. I believe we have over 100 participants, so thank you very much. My presentation tonight will contain a lot of great information about the Rahway Valley, so it'll be a little lengthy. So if you have to step away or log off, we are recording the show and we'll make it available online at a later date, and also be immediately posted to Facebook once we are done. Also, feel free to submit questions during the presentation. I'll be happy to answer them at the end of the show. So here we go, freight operations on the Rahway Valley. So before we get started, a little bit about myself. My name is Richie King. I'm the treasurer of the Tri-State Railway Historical Society. My day job is working for Jaguar Land Rover North America as a sales planning analyst. I forecast sales volume for all Land Rover products sold in the United States, the largest market for Land Rover worldwide, which basically sets the pace for our factories in the United Kingdom and Europe. I'm a graduate of Union County College and Ramapo College of New Jersey with degrees in business admin and accounting. I'm also a landowner. I own 10 acres in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, where I spend a lot of time camping with friends and family. So as you probably know, I'm kind of young to be writing about the Rahway Valley. I'm 26 years old, so you're probably wondering how someone my age got interested in the Rahway Valley, which was abandoned 28 years ago. Well, I grew up in Union, New Jersey, which is one of the 6 towns that was served by the railroad. In my growing up, I would see the abandoned tracks, and my curiosity basically got the better of me. My interest sparked what has now been about 7 years of research into this railroad. So I started when I was about 19. Learning about this history and operations of this road has definitely been a wonderful experience and introduced me into a lot of people, including Tri-State itself. Exposed me to a lot of knowledge I didn't have before, and resulted in 2, soon to be 3 books on the Rahway Valley. So just what was the Rahway Valley? The Rahway Valley was basically a quirky little short line railroad that operated on 11.8 miles of track in northern New Jersey. Its informal, unpretentious operations and its small collection of colorful employees and management gave the Rahway Valley an endearing stature that really extended beyond the limits of its short system. It was begun as a means to develop New Orange, which is now known as Kenilworth, which was meant to become a large planned manufacturing town. When those prospects petered out, the railroad was acquired and extended by Lewis Keller, owner of the Baltusrol Golf Club, to bring folks to his golf course. That ambition, while fulfilled, proved to be less fruitful than anticipated. After industrial development along the line was sparked during World War I and reached its zenith during the post-war boom of the late 40s and on all the 50s, the railroad found a solid footing as a bustling freight carrier. Connections were made with three major Class I railroads, the CNJ and Lehigh Valley at the southern end and the Lackawanna at the northern end, which enabled the railroad to afford its clientele competitive freight rates and let it act as a bridge route between its northern and southern ends. Operations were conducted with a pair of 600 horsepower, non-MU equipped General Electric 70-tonners, one red and one green. The railroad system included a 7.1 mile long main line, which stretched from Aldine to Summit, the half-mile Lehigh Valley branch, which connected to its namesake railroad at Roselle Park, and two industrial branches, the mile-long Rahway River branch in Kenilworth and the 3-mile-long Norks Heights branch that ran in Union and Maplewood. So basically in this presentation, I will go over how the Rahway Valley conducted its freight operations, giving a synopsis of the typical day on the line, as well as some background on its customer base, interspersed with some anecdotes. I definitely hope you get a real sense of the railroad's character and business. So this presentation will cover the Rahway Valley of the 1966 and 1967, roughly that time period. The decline of coal as a home heating fuel and the subsiding of the post-war housing boom had caused freight tonnages to fall off after they reached their peak on the 1950s. However, the last gasp of the area's industrial development in the early to mid 1960s had picked up some of the slack, and the Rahway Valley was still a very busy operation. In fact, the railroad's lone train crew would usually work 12-hour days. The railroad served a large, diverse customer base comprised of small to medium-sized industries. The last bastions of the former bulk of the railroad's business were the two remaining coal dealers, Falk and Kingston on the Nork Heights branch. There were also the building supply yards such as Stevens Miller in Summit, Jaeger Lumber in Union, and Neal and Spanier in Kenilworth, and Maplewood Building Specialties in Maplewood. There were still three active steel plants, Allied Steel, Westfield Sheet Metal, and Jones and Laughlin in Kenilworth. There are also several oddball customers, such as two heavy equipment dealers, Foley and Bender, which were both in Union, Gut Broad in Kenilworth, which dealt in landscape materials, and Scheibel in Springfield, which dealt motor oil. The balance of the railroad's customer base were manufacturers, distribution warehouses, and the few remaining patrons of the railroad steam tracks. So I'm going to do my best to give an overview of these customers over the course of my presentation, including commodities shipped over the railroad. So most, if not all, the information presented tonight will have come from Walt Switz. For those who don't know Switz, he is a retired railroad whose decades-long career spanned the entire United States. I really do not recall all of the railroads he worked for, but usually when I mention one, he responds, "I work there too." If my memory serves me right, some of the railroads included the Jersey Central, the Lehigh Valley, the Morristown and Erie, Conrail, the Santa Fe, the Minnesota Commercial, and the Canadian Pacific. Most important to his presentation is where Switz started his career, the Rahway Valley. George Clark, the tempestuous, sardonic president and general manager of the railroad, gave Switz his very first railroading job at age 19 in February of 1966. Clarky, as Switz calls him, hired him as a brakeman after his persistence wore the old man down. Clark was rightly impressed with Switz and promoted him to conductor several months later when he was just 20 years old. The best part about Switz is, besides his general putting up with me, a 20-something-year-old asking incessant questions, is that his memory is virtually eidetic. Walt can tell you about the customers he drilled, the nature of their business, how they got cars, how often they got cars, the types of cars they got, the road names of those cars, and even the length of the customer's siding. The information contained in this presentation, for the most part, did not come from any documents or paperwork. It all came from Walt's memory and out of his mouth over the course of several extended interviews I've had with him over the last couple years. So the following is Walt's telling of how he began working at the Rahway Valley and his first few months there. Things on railroads were far more lax than they are today. The government had oversight of certain things back then, but nowhere near as much authority as they do now. Today, they regulate not only what you have to do to get hired, but also what you need to do to stay on the job. I hired out on the Rahway Valley in February 1966 at 19 years old, answering one of George Clark's funny ads for a brakeman in the Elizabeth Daily Journal. I went to the Kenilworth office to inquire about the job and met a man who looked like a bum. The man claimed he was the watchman. I asked about an opening for a brakeman, but was told no. I went back about a week later. Again, the bum was there, but this time he revealed himself to be George Clark, the president of the railroad. At the end of the visit, Clark hired me because of my persistence. There were no tests. I didn't fill out anything beside the basic information. There was no official application form. I didn't go for any physical. Clark asked me if I had a driver's license. He figured that if I could see well enough to drive, that I could see well enough to work on the railroad. There were no rules, just get out there and be careful. Don't get hurt. On my first day, we just got on the engine and we went. This was my first railroad job. I knew a little bit about railroading just from watching train crews when I was younger. It's a good thing I did because they really didn't tell you that much at all. There was no official training on the Rahway Valley. The conductor I broke for was Tony DeFrancisco, whose philosophy on railroading was it's common sense. He was a big guy, smoked a cigar, and had a big ring of keys. He was impatient, not a good trainer, hot-tempered. I would ask him questions and that would be his reply. That's all railroading is. It's just common sense. That was tough. No one on the Rahway Valley was qualified on the connecting railroads. They told you to be careful when out on another railroad. If you encountered a signal and it was red, you'd stop. That's all you were told. Early on, they tell me which switches to throw. The more experienced crew members would do the cutting and coupling up and stuff like that. One time, we were going to spot cars at Levinson in Union. It was the furthest customer on a long siding shared with Jersey Tab Card and Essex Chair. We needed to switch cars around so we could spot Levinson's cars down below. I'm at the switch, they're making moves, pulling back and forth, matching cars in, switch. They finally get everything together and start shoving in. I saw the conductor waving a hand signal, which I thought meant to cut off. So I get on the engine and pull the pin. I hear Frank Frote, the engineer in the cab, yell no. Frank blows the horn as the car starts sailing into the sidetrack. Everything ended up being fine, but it could have been a really bad accident. The conductor, Tony, comes back and asks me why I pulled the pin. I told him he'd given me a cut sign. He responded that it wasn't a cut sign, that he was signaling me to get on top of the car. I asked why he didn't tell me beforehand. All he ever told me was to take care of the switch. After the first month, I thought, this sucks. I'd get to the point sometimes where I felt like quitting because they didn't even lay out the basics. It was just very frustrating. Evidently, conductor Tony DeFrancisco wasn't cut out for railroading after all and left the Rahway Valley in summer of 1966 to go drive truck for Hudai Quarry in Springfield. Afterward, at age 20, Clark promoted me to conductor. So now I'll take you through the bulk of the presentation, which is basically what Walt's typical workday on the Rahway Valley was like. So work on the Rahway Valley was Monday through Friday, starting about 9 o'clock in the morning. Mondays were the busiest days as cars would be dropped off at the interchanges over the weekend, and the railroad could move as many as 50 cars in a single day. In the morning, the employees would arrive and park behind the Kenilworth office. Getting to work in the morning, Walt would have to make his way past the dogs that live at the Kenilworth office, such as Blip, Bolivar, Sally, and Lady. A big mud bloodhound named Klondike was allowed inside the office. He was George Clark's dog, who Clark always called Hot Nuts for always humping the other dogs. In the morning, the engineer, Frank Frote, would head directly to the engine house. George Davis, the superintendent, was usually there, so he'd talk with him. The brakeman would either follow Frote into the engine house or hang with Switz, the conductor. George and Bob Clark would be there early. In fact, George Clark had an apartment in a portion of the old station. So Switz would head into the agent's office and would check in to see what was lined up for that day's work. So just to give you a little background on some of the men that Walt worked with. Frank Frote was the engineer. He had been a tremendous fireman, having been with the C&J and the Lehigh Valley and fired under the Rahway Valley's Carl Neese from 1919 to 1920. In 1934, he took a permanent position with the Rahway Valley as fireman under Bill Snyder. Frote got the engineer's seat after Snyder retired in 1939. From many accounts, was a very untidy man, often wearing the same dirt, grease, and sludge that also adorned the locomotives. The unkempt Frote would not be allowed to sit with the crew at lunch. Unable to afford new work clothes, he would change out his coveralls once a year. Frote would buy him a new set each Christmas. Or Clark would buy him a set each Christmas. George Davis had been with the Rahway Valley since 1927. He had previously been brakeman and conductor before becoming the superintendent in 1950. He was a hyper individual, always moving fast, possessed little patience, and did everything in a hurry. Davis was something of an expert in all operating departments. George Clark depended on him very heavily, and he could pinch hit in most any position. With only blocking and jacks, Davis would rectify most any derailment. He was dedicated to the Rahway Valley and was a very hard worker. He knew the railroad inside and out. George Clark was a big, awkward, disheveled man, moody and tempestuous, reflexively profane, and sardonically humorous. And he knew himself better than most other people did. He was hired by the Rahway Valley in 1920 after his father, Roger Clark, moved the family east from Oregon to take a position at the railroad. Clark became the president and general manager after his father's death in 1932 and managed to keep the railroad's book in black ink even during the depths of the Great Depression. The railroad turned a profit in 1936 and every year thereafter under Clark's leadership. He was crass, hardworking, no-nonsense railroader with a very interesting sense of humor, and basically let no one subvert the railroad by appealing to his more generous tendencies. His colorful personality definitely made the railroad more than what it was and endeared it to some. Clark once said, "I'm an outspoken man. I say what I think and some people like me for it and some other people hate me for it." He always wore work clothes to the office because, as he said, "I never dress up because if I did, no one would recognize me." He had no patience for blowhards or hotshots, saying, "I think we'd all be better off if there was less talk and more work." Bob Clark, in contrast to his father, George, was more meek and mild personality and thought his dad, in a comment to another employee, was nuts. He started out in the Rahway Valley as a member of the track gang in 1947, and after serving in the Korean War, returned to the railroad as general freight agent and car accountant. It was his dad's sincere wish to make a real railroad man out of him in order to make up for his dad, who had more or less been a complete washout due to lack of education, in George Clark's own words. So Walt Switz tells us that there was one train crew. We worked with an engineer, a conductor, and 2 brakemen. Whenever a brakeman would call out sick or there was a vacancy, one of the members of the track crew would fill in. The track crew was still mostly Italian immigrants who spoke but a few words of broken English. They fill in, I'll put it this way, they didn't put handbrakes on and they didn't couple air hoses. They were helpful, but all they basically did was flag crossings, throw switches, and pass signals, so we had to adjust for that. Tony Vizzoni, who was the only one that really ever came out. The other guy, Frank Palmadesso, who George Clark called Flash, was even less fluent in English. You could tell Tony that we'd be heading to go drill Carter Bell, and he'd respond, okay, Carter Bella. One of the morning chores before departing might be to refuel the locomotive. Walt snapped his photograph of Frank Frote standing in the doorway of the pump house, fueling number 16 at Kenilworth. The 70-tonners held about 500 gallons of fuel and burned about 50 a day. The fuel used to come in tank cars out of Bayonne. While fueling, Walt also snapped his photograph of O. Winston Ling's Rutland Combine in his XC&J caboose at Kenilworth. Link had been storing his car at Kenilworth since 1961 and slowly but surely restoring it. Link used to run an extension cord out of the engine house for electric. George Clark used to bitch about who was paying the electric bill. A couple times while Walt worked there, they took the combine up to the Y in Union to turn it around so Link could get at the opposite side. In a letter to a friend, George Clark remarked, "I really like the crackpot Link, who has been farting around making repairs to his old Rutland combine during the past few months. Just what in hell he has in mind, I do not know, as while we are very good friends, the fact remains that he is very secretive." The caboose belonged to a rail fan. One day it showed up at Aldine, and the RV crew hooked it up just to the end of the train and ran around with it just for fun. So back to the workday. Typically, a list of cars that Monsanto wanted, which was the railroad's biggest customer, which were stored about the railroad, would be provided on a slip of paper to the conductor. In other instances, instructions for special moves, perhaps a customer that needed a drill, or information about something out of the ordinary would be provided. There were no official train orders, or even a rule book for that matter. In the meantime, the brakeman and Froat would crank the engine house door open. The brakeman would pull the oil drip pans out from under the trucks of the locomotive, wipe off the engine block, turn 3 to 4 oil strainers, and start the engine. Monday and Tuesdays were typically the heaviest days, so the newer, stronger, green-painted number 17 was used. The older, red-painted number 16 was used on Wednesdays through Fridays, usually the slower days. Froat and the brakeman would move the locomotive out onto the main track in front of the depot and wait for the conductor to arrive with whatever instructions there may be, and then away they went. The first move of the day was to gather up any inbound cars for the customers on the Rahway River branch, which the crew called the can branch, that were stored about the railroad. The conductor would be responsible for locating the cars that Monsanto needed. So the Rahway Valley didn't keep a record of where the freight cars were stored on the railroad, so the job was to find them. The crew would, some of the cars were pretty obvious, like when the cars were stored across from the engine house, or tucked in, or across from the office, or tucked in next to the engine house. Eventually, the crew would find the cars needed along with anything else for the branch brought in the day before, and possibly a car for France Campbell and Darling or International Wines. So Monsanto was the railroad's largest customer. They would receive inbound loads of a variety of different raw plastic materials and would only take delivery of certain grades depending on what they were doing that day. So carloads would be held until Monsanto requested them. The Kenilworth office would speak to Monsanto via telephone each morning about the cars they needed and would compile a list and provide it to the conductor. Any inbound cars for National Tool, Westfield Sheet Metal, or Allied Steel would have been held from the previous workday. All these cars might be spread out along the railroad as the crew would have stuffed them in any siding where there was room, as the Rahway Valley did not have a rail yard of its own. The lock joint siding, Mike's Coal, International Wines lead, White Labs lead, and Volco sidings in Kenilworth were typically used for storage. Originally, before the Monsanto received its runaround, any car for the branch had to be ahead of the locomotive and shoved down, as all the sidings on the branch were facing point switches. So anything plucked from Mike's Coal or Volco for that day had to be flown by the locomotive, as those were trailing point switches. After the crew assembled the cars they needed, they would shove down the branch. Monsanto was drilled every day, and the foreman at the plant would expect the train about 10 a.m. in the morning. The foreman would have a slip of paper drawn up for the crew, noting where cars were to be placed, and if any cars already there needed to be respotted. They would receive 1 to 6 cars in a day, depending on how things were going at the plant. Someone from the crew would go back to the building where the trucks were always parked and tell the plant workers that they had to move. The crew would also respot cars already at the plant, perhaps reposition it closer to the building. Many carloads of different grades of plastic material would come in from Monsanto. The company would only take delivery of certain materials needed for what they were producing at the time. So the balance, the plastic cars were stored elsewhere. When the cars would come in and stored along the railroad, sometimes someone from the company would come out and take samples of the material. They would climb up on a car, pop the seal, and open the hatch. They had a cup at the end of a long stick to take samples. They would dip down into each of the compartments and drop the material into a paper bag. The samples would be sent to their laboratory to make sure the plastic was a proper blend of the material, right moisture content, etc. Occasionally, Monsanto would refuse a carload because it was contaminated, as either water or dust had seeped into the compartment. A lot of times, the Rahway Valley would bring in a car to the plant and they would sample it then. Most of the time, everything was okay with the content of the cars. So the Gering Products division of Monsanto Corporation produced plastic compounds and polyethylene films. Gering/Monsanto manufactured plastic molding pellets and compounds to be made into sheeting sold under the trade name of Gerpack. The sheeting was used in building, agricultural, and packaging industries, and the most major purchaser of these outbound carloads of plastic was Procter & Gamble in Mahoupany, Pennsylvania. Gering also produced colorants and a few consumer products such as floor mats and garden and soaker hoses. Monsanto mostly received inbound loaded hoppers of raw plastic pellets, about 80% of their overall car loadings. There was a mix of what types of cars these cars would arrive in. There were Monsanto cars, the ribside hoppers that were gray with the big M and MOHX and MCTX reporting marks. The red DuPont Alathon cars were also typical. The balance of Monsanto's traffic was inbound, empty 50-foot insulated boxcars. They could be C&O, Lehigh Valley, SP, or others. The company would load scrap pieces of garden hose in big baskets and load them into their boxcars to ship them out. They'd get 1 or 2 boxcars a week. Sometimes loaded boxcars would come in with scrap plastic. Specifically, one such load came in a blue Louisville and Nashville boxcar. Monsanto would occasionally order this scrap material and melt it down to reuse it. Certain products Monsanto produced didn't require the precision or pristine material, so they would utilize the scrap. National Tool was another customer on the Royal River branch, and they would get a car in about every 1 to 2 weeks. So they were a tool and die works and also a manufacturer of Bakelite molds. They received sheet steel in open 50-foot gondolas. 1 or 2 cars would arrive each week. Occasionally, they would get in 2 cars at a time, and on at least one occasion, they received 3. Their materials came out of the steel mills at Sparrows Point, Maryland. Typical road names of the cars would be B&O, C&O, EJ&E, New York Central, PRR, and RF&P. Once a load came in an EL car. The track was long enough to accommodate any amount of cars National Tool would receive at a time. However, the crew would have to shift them around. National Tool was quick to unload a car. The crew would spot their loads and continue to drill the other plants on the branch. And by the time they were done and ready to leave, the foreman at National Tool would come out and say the car was ready to be taken. National Tool would take perhaps 45 minutes to unload a car. Allied Steel, seen on the left, was another customer. Their car loading would be sporadic. They fabricated structural steel plates and sheet metal pressure vessels, dryer ovens, spray booths, and electrical panels. Allied took inbound loads of sheet steel, end caps, and steel beams. The materials came in out of Baltimore. They received end caps for big oil tanks and gondola cars. One car would have 2 or 3 different sizes of caps. Sometimes the caps were bigger than the width of the cars, so they had to be braced up against the sides of the car. Most often, however, they'd be stacked, nested. Occasionally, they received carloads of sheet steel, and when the sheets were longer, they'd receive idler cars to accommodate for the length. Allied would roll the sheets and put the caps on the ends to make the tanks. Earlier on, the company had made steel structural forms for building construction. Cars for Allied came in flurries. About 4 or 5 cars a week would come in for a solid week or 2, and then it would settle down. Cars wouldn't come in for a week or 2. Perhaps a single car would come in, but then nothing would come in for another week or more. Westfield Sheet Metal Works, which is seen on the right in this picture, would get a car every 3 to 4 months. The latter industry, they had no private siding, so any car for them had to be spotted right on the branch alongside their fence. The company, still in business today, does sheet metal fabrication work for ventilation systems. The company shipped outbound carloads of big fabricated dust collector bins, about 8 to feet 10 8 to 10 feet square with appurtenances. The company would call for a 50-foot flat car off the C&J. Those reporting marks could be B&O, C&J, or a PRR car. The Rahway Valley would spot it for them along their fence, and Westfield would call for a crane to come in and load the unit onto the flat car. The car could sit for 2 or 3 days before being ready for shipment. This caused the Rahway Valley train crew to perform extra switching moves, as they would have to move it out of the way every day while Monsanto was being drilled in the morning. So after the unit was finally secured, the Rahway Valley would have to wait for the C&J car inspector to come up and sign off that the unit was properly secured and give the go-ahead to move it out. So while drilling the Rahway River branch, the crew would gather outbound cars and take those back with them, and also simultaneously block those cars for either the C&J or the Lehigh Valley. There would seldom be a car for the EL. Afterwards, they'd pull the outbounds off the branch, and that would conclude car movements for that portion of the railroad for the rest of the day. So this is a train coming over North Michigan Avenue in Kenilworth. So the outbound loads off the branch would be taken east and set off on the White Labs lead to be picked up towards the end of the day's work. Occasionally, if there was some other extenuating circumstance, the outbound C&J and Lehigh Valley cars would be split, with one portion being set off at the White Labs lead and the other on the International Wines lead. Very seldom there would be a car off the Rahway River branch that had to go for the EL, which would be set off somewhere to be taken with the train when it returned back westbound. The White Labs lead was so long and unobstructed at that time as the crew could shove 25 cars down the track without needing to protect the move, despite not being able to see anything around the curve. Later on, the company built a fence line and put a gate across the track, and the railroad could only fit 12 to 15 cars after that. So if the crew had a lot of cars, they had to be careful. Occasionally, the crew would leave the gate open, and White Labs would call the Kenilworth office to complain. So this picture shows Rahway Valley 16 on the White Labs lead. You can see the train on the main line and the Garden State Parkway in the background. So this is just a brief film clip of showing a set out being made on the White Labs lead. It's a few seconds long. So White Labs was a pharmaceuticals manufacturer. Their plant was set really far back off the main line. So the main line is here cutting underneath the Garden State Parkway. And their lead was 1,700 feet long, curved, went through the woods here, and went to their plant up on Galloping Hill Road. The company wasn't a huge shipper on the railroad, but they did ship inbound carloads of bags of corn syrup in boxcars and petroleum jelly in 2-dome silver GATX tank cars. They were never really a major carload shipper despite the very long length of their siding. They'd get a car in about every 2 to 3 months. Occasionally they'd get a insulated 50-foot boxcar in to load with pharmaceutical products to ship out. So after that, and after cutting off the outbounds, the locomotive would run light down to Aldine to pick up the C&J interchange. Ordinarily, if there was an outbound pickup from Crossfield on Westfield Avenue, or Valley Road rather, the Rahway Valley would run light with the locomotive into the Cranford Yard. So this is a picture of that happening early in the morning. The locomotive just crossed Fatute Avenue in Kenilworth, heading down to the C&J. So when going to and from the C&J, the Rahway Valley would have to cross South Michigan Avenue in Kenilworth. So Walt Switz provides the following story. There was one crossing accident on Michigan Avenue. We were going to the C&J and it was raining. There were a lot of parked cars, which was limiting visibility. We started over the crossing, the flagman ran out actually, and then a car came. The driver of the car obviously didn't know what was going on. The driver hit the brakes, semi-skidded, and just caught the corner of the step on the engine. There were 6 people in this little compact car, and they were coming out like clowns. The accident did a couple $100 worth of damage to the car, but only wrinkled the steps on one of the 70-tonners. No big deal for us. So this is actually a newspaper article from that incident. If there was an outbound car at Crossfield, the crew would pick it up on the way down and shove it into the yard. The conductor would have to alert the agent at Cranford if there was a Crossfield car set out in the yard. So this is a picture of 17 shoving in a tank car into the yard. The locomotive would pull up and the crew would look in the yard and could normally tell which track was stuffed with their cars simply by the number and appearance of the cars. The crew would also observe to make sure the Cranford drill wasn't working on the other end of the yard. If the drill was still switching, the Rahway Valley wouldn't couple onto anything just yet. If the crew didn't see the drill or it was working out on the other side of the yard or down at Romarovsky, the locomotive would nose into the track the crew thought was theirs and couple up. The crew would walk the track and look at the cars, making sure the handbrakes are off and connect the air hoses. Typically, there would be anywhere from 8 to 14 cars to pick up. On Mondays, there could be 15 to 20. So the Rahway Valley's interchange cars at Cranford would be brought in and handled by a variety of C&J trains. The local westbound freight out of Jersey City, bound for Phillipsburg, the JG1, the so-called maybe freight, because it would have so much work to do that maybe it would finish by day's end and maybe it wouldn't, would work at Elizabethport, Cranford, Plainfield, Boundbrook, Somerville, and Raritan, and all the westbound local work from North Branch to Phillipsburg. The train would get to Cranford very early in the morning, about daybreak. JG1 would make setouts at Cranford Yard for Aldine, Cranford Junction, and Cranford proper, Garwood, Westfield, Roselle, to be worked by the local Cranford drill. This setup would include Rahway Valley cars. Occasionally, JG1 would pick up a flat car or gondola that the Rahway Valley had set out and was needed west of Cranford for some purpose. In the evening, the train would return eastbound out of Phillipsburg as GJ2. So I don't believe this is that train, but it is a C&J train coming through Cranford, Aldine, underneath the Garden State Parkway. And the yard that the Rahway Valley interchange is to the right. So cars coming eastbound over the C&J were set out on the other side of the main at Cranford Junction, which was the Staten Island yard. At least 2 or 3 trains come up to C&J off the B&O and would make a set out at Cranford Junction, which may have cars to the Rahway Valley. There would also be a job out of Allentown, possibly 2 jobs during the course of the night and early morning that set off cars, including stuff for the Rahway Valley. The Cranford drill would have to sort out whichever cars needed to come across to Cranford Yard, including the Rahway Valleys. Sometimes, if the trains were late or there was a lot of work on a Monday morning, and the yard on the CERT side was full, the Cranford drill would have perhaps 20 or 30 cars that have to be crossed over. This would sometimes be done in 2 bites because there wasn't enough room to run around in the yard if everything was brought at once. So the Rahway Valley would sometimes have to wait for the Cranford drill to finish switching their cars onto their track before the crew could even couple up. After checking their cars, the conductor would sometimes, with the brakeman, walk to the agent's office. About 1966 or so, the C&J closed their Aldine depot as part of changes being made to accommodate the impending Aldine plan. The C&J arranged with the Staten Island to utilize a small office in the eastern portion of their building at Cranford Junction, which is seen in this photo on South Avenue. The agent at this time was Dave Corman, who worked with a clerk, Lenny, at a big double desk. Later on, for whatever reason, the CERT told the C&J they had to get out of the Cranford Junction office. At that time, the C&J positioned an old caboose alongside the former roundhouse and made it the Aldine Cranford Freight Agency's office. Most of the time, the Rahway Valley's conductor would have to wait for the paperwork to be finished by the C&J agent. This could take 15 or 20 minutes, or sometimes even a half an hour. The C&J would hand over the paperwork, and the conductor would walk up the Rahway Valley's track and check the way bills against the car numbers and chalk up the interchange railroad and consignee onto the cars. There wasn't any switching typically done at Aldine by the Rahway Valley. Afterward, the crew would walk up to the head end, get on the locomotive, and they'd head back to their home rails. The rear brakeman would open the derail after the Rahway Valley train cleared. So the picture in the lower right shows a brakeman opening that derail after they leave. So this shot was taken at Aldine. George Clark is actually on all fours in this picture, getting a handle on this derailment as president and general manager. The train had gone through the new spring derail at the east end of the yard. After this derailment, Clark had the crew manually throw the derail. This picture is actually taken by Walt Switz. This picture, also taken by Walt of the same derailment, shows this nickel plate car. The car got knocked off of its truck, and you can also see a Rahway Valley chalk mark underneath the number and a track jack just to the left of the coupler. After a different incident derailing cars over a grade crossing, George Clark claimed the crew wasn't keeping an eye open, so he had the seat removed from the diesel engine. The crew resorted to sitting on milk crates and spike barrels for a while. So speaking of chalk marks, the Rahway Valley crews had their own system of chalk shorthand. This was done to indicate where the cars had come from, as they should go back towards their home railroad via the railroad that the Rahway Valley had received them from. The marks would also show a car's destination on the Rahway Valley. Cars were marked on the ends near the cut levers. Sometimes the crew used a yellow grease crayon and it didn't wash off easily, and sometimes the same car would come back months later with the Rahway Valley marks still on it. So this picture Walt took shows a derailed CB&Q boxcar on the uphill run to Summit. They had about 5 or 6 cars, and this boxcar was 2 cars behind the engine and derailed at the EL hold track. The trucks turned at an odd angle. But more importantly to the discussion about chalk marks is you can see the double X chalk mark denoting a car picked up from the EL. So that meant that that empty had to go back towards the interchange where it was picked up for the quickest routing to its home railroad. So back to switching, back to freight ops. So departing the C&J, the Rahway Valley would basically have to cross the busy 4-lane Westfield Avenue. And Walt Switz tells an interesting story that occurred there. While I was working on the Rahway Valley, guys came and they went. Many left or were fired after a few days, weeks, or months. One guy was a hillbilly, is the best way I can describe him. He looked like he never took a bath. George Clark didn't like him, and Clark was a pretty good judge of character and could tell a lot about people. One time he told me that when us employees cashed our paychecks, he could see where they were cashed. He said most guys cashed them at banks or some kind of business. Clark said this guy's checks are always cashed at Frenchie's Bar in Roselle Park. He was in an altercation on Westfield Avenue, which is where this picture was taken. He was flagging the crossing, and an impatient man driving a convertible scooted around him in the approaching train. He whacked the guy's car with the flag. The driver came to a halt by the gas station there and got out. They got into an argument. I didn't get involved and told Frank Frote, the engineer, come on, let's go. And we continued over the grade crossing. Meanwhile, the driver goes to drag our hillbilly brakeman off the engine. He goes up to the toolbox on the back of the engine and grabs the spike bar and goes after the driver with the bar. Soon enough, there was blood about the engine steps. The driver ended up suing the railroad, and I was called in for a deposition. The driver and the railroad settled the case, but I don't believe it was for much, maybe a couple $100. The last I heard of our hillbilly brakeman, that he was had moved out to California and was working on a railroad out there. So this is a Walt Switz photo of brakeman Johnny Kahn flagging Westfield Avenue in Aldine. Kahn was from Bayonne and had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad and the C&J. He was also a steam engine buff and later worked for the Black River and Western. Here at Aldine, Brakeman Khan uses a huge flag to protect the grade crossing. At this time, the agent was still in the old Aldine depot in the background, and the blue 63 Chevy belonged to him. Okay, so leaving Aldine, if there was an inbound car for Crossfield, which always came in the C&J, and there weren't so many cars that they'd block Westfield Avenue, the train would pull up, make the cut, and spot the car on the siding. Sometimes, if the train was heavy, perhaps with inbound cement cars, the crew might make 2 trips up from the C&J. So in this picture all the way on the left, that red and gray tank car is a tank car for Crossfield. So Crossfield Products, which is located on Valley Road, just a little bit beyond the Westfield Avenue crossing, was a manufacturer of construction coatings, overlay, and fluid apply flooring materials. They still exist today at the same location. They were a regular carload shipper of liquid latex, crude rubber, and pumice, which was granulated stone used in the production of flooring materials. The carloads of liquid latex would arrive in red and gray tank cars out of Wilmington, Delaware about twice a month. Carloads of pumice would come from the Midwest, usually EJ&E 40-foot box cars as well. Occasionally a Northampton and Bath boxcar would come in loaded with hydraulic cement out of eastern Pennsylvania. On at least one occasion, an L&E boxcar arrived. So after Crossfields, the train would pull up to the switch where the main line met the Lehigh Valley branch, which the crew usually called the junction switch. It didn't have an official name. The crew would sometimes get rid of any cars to the Rahway River branch, which were usually the Monsanto cars, which are seen here, if they had room to put them somewhere around the junction switch, like the Mike's Coal Siding, International Lines, or Lockjoy. Or they would just leave them on the main and put them into Volco Siding later on the way up to Kenilworth proper. And perhaps line up a couple of other cars in the process for later on in the day. If there are any overhead cars for the EL, sometimes there were 2 or 3, the crew might switch to get those cars blocked together or just let them sit until later on. Whatever the case, the balance of the C&J cars would be left on the main behind the junction switch. Next, the locomotive would run light down to the Lehigh Valley interchange at Roselle Park to pick up inbound cars. The locomotive would ordinarily tie up at the east end of the yard at the bumping block against Locust Street, where the tracks were truncated as part of the Aldine plan. Walt Switz took this photo of a weathered number 16 at the Lehigh Valley interchange at Roselle Park. If you look very closely, you'll notice a broken cab window. Walt was standing in the cab of the locomotive and they bounced through a low spot and Walt's hip slammed into the glass. The rivet in his jeans spiderwebbed the glass, and George Davis blew up at Walt. "Don't you know how hard it is to replace that glass, goddammit?" At the same spot, Walt snapped his photograph of number 16 sporting its new paint. George Clark had paid a couple of guys $500 to brush paint the locomotive. They finished in about 2 or 3 weeks. If you notice, the couplers flopped over to one side in this picture. George Davis liked to keep the couplers heavily greased so they'd flop around like a fish when riding along. The greased couplers could be a problem when making a hitch and it'd occasionally flop over to one side. This shot, also taken at the same location, was taken by Walt and shows brakeman George Matz sitting in the cab window. According to Walt Switz, George Matz was one of the brakemen I worked with. He was from one of the Oranges and was on furlough from the Erie Lackawanna. He was a firebug. We'd spend a lot of time switching at the Y and at the Essex chair switch during the cold months. He'd say, "Let's build a fire to keep warm while we were switching." We'd get a bunch of stuff, pile it up, light it up, and keep our hands warm for a few minutes. That became more or less a habit until Carpenter Steel complained that we were leaving unattended fires. Another time, a hopper was left on the Y leg. The manager of industrial plywood asked us if he could throw some scraps of wood into the hopper to clean up around the warehouse. We said, "Yeah, go ahead." When we came back to pick up the car for interchange, we looked in the car and discovered it was about a third full of 2x4s and old plywood. Max suggested that the crew burn the wood as they did not expect so much in the car. Mats lit the wood and figured we could let it burn on the way to Summit to get rid of it. The car started to smoke heavily and soon flames were licking over the car top. We shoved the car into the yard at Summit and went to the tower to hand in our waybills like nothing was the matter. On the way back down the hill, we started to hear sirens and fire trucks. So back to ops. So originally, the Rahway Valley's conductor would have to walk a block and cross over the Lehigh Valley main line to the old Roselle Park Depot where the agent's office was. The agent would hand over the Rahway Valley's package of paperwork. Later on, the agent's office was moved to a small concrete block building alongside the team track within the yard itself. So the local freight out of Oak Island, known as OP5, which was Oak Island to Port Reading, and sometimes referred to as the Clark Drill, handled the Rahway Valley interchange at Roselle Park. OP5 started work at about 8 a.m. in the Oak Island yard. Its first stop was Hillside, where there were a few customers. Then it traveled down to Townley, which was this picture was taken, on what was called the work track. If it was a busy day, OP5 would leave its car at Townley and run the Rahway Valley cars only up to Roselle Park and set them off before running late back up to Townley and starting its own work. If it was a light day for OP5, the entire train would come down to Roselle Park, which might only be a handful of cars, and would back down into the yard to set off the Rahway Valley's cars and make any pickups before proceeding towards Cranford and Clark. So this picture shows OP5 at Roselle Park. OP5 would show up at Roselle Park anywhere between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. normally. The train often had a lot of work to do to the point where it was sometimes making 2 round trips between Townley and Clark. Sometimes OP5 would run a bunch of cars up the line just to get rid of them and out of the way. Then OP5 would come back, get its other cars, and do other work. So the Rahway Valley could sometimes be stuck waiting for OP5 because that train might have a heavy day, and it took a while for that crew to get their cars sorted out before they could get to Roselle Park. The Rahway Valley crew could be waiting for their cars in Roselle Park for an hour or an hour and a half, so it was a logical place for them to take their lunch break. Mickey's Deli at the corner of Chestnut Street and Lincoln Avenue was where the crew usually went to grab a bite to eat. Occasionally, there might already be cars in the yard waiting for pickup by the Rahway Valley. These cars would include empty gondolas for loading, with scrap turnings at Elastic Stop Nut in Union, or sometimes a road job would set off cars at Roselle Park for the RV. Oftentimes, those carloads were for Binder Machinery, and they would come in this way. The road job heading to Oak Island would make its cut up at Aldine and bring the cars down into Roselle Park and leave it for the Rahway Valley. Then would go back, get their train, and proceed to Oak Island. This would usually happen over the course of a weekend. Once OP5 arrived, there would be an average about 4 to 6 cars to pick up. On Monday, there might be as many as 10 inbound cars to take out of Roselle Park. Walt Switz took these shots from the cab window of number 17 at Roselle Park. The new passenger station is under construction as well as new bridges. The Lehigh Valley was being elevated while the Walt worked at the Rahway Valley as part of the Aldine plan. The Rahway Valley's interchange was moved from Chestnut Street to Locust Street. The old yard became a parking lot for the new station. The shot on the left shows the shoe fly track that paralleled the new embankment, permitting trains to pass the construction area at ground level. So after that, the train would head back up the Lehigh Valley branch and return to the junction switch. One of the inbound Lehigh Valley cars might be for A.H. Gutbrod Company, which you're seeing on the left there, on the lock joint sighting. So the crew would have to perform a flying switch for that, as the switch was a facing point. Gutbrod dealt in landscape supplies and would receive a carload of peat moss once or twice a week, which you can see stacked up in that shot. Their shipments usually came in Canadian National Maple Leaf boxcars, and more seldom shipments would come in a Canadian Pacific car. Gutbrod cars were spotted on the old lock joint siding between the switch and Fairfield Avenue. There are about 2.5 car lengths of space Guttbride would unload peat moss from the ground with a forklift and a pallet. The moss would be thrown from the boxcar and onto the pallet. Sometimes it would be directly loaded onto a truck. Occasionally, 2 carloads would come in at a time. Once that work was done, the remainder of the Lehigh Valley cars would be matched in with the C&J cars still sitting on the main as best they could be, and the train would proceed westbound to Kenilworth proper. The crew would perform any local work at Kenilworth, setting out any inbound cars for International Wines, Volco, Papyrus, Jones and Laughlin Steel, or the Kenilworth Team Track, and picking up EL outbounds, if any. International Wines received tank cars and box cars of alcoholic beverages for bottling and distribution. The tank cars would be 6-dome wine cars, usually Southern Pacific. They would offload the tank cars into their building and bottle the wine themselves. The wine would be shipped from Gallo Winery in Modesto, California. The company would receive a car every 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes a car would come in late in the day off the EL, and International wouldn't want it to show up on their siding overnight, or they would receive 2 cars at once and didn't want to take delivery of both. The RV would tuck the car alongside the engine house, or sometimes clear the 3rd bay of the engine house and lock it up for safekeeping. The next morning, the first thing the crew would do is run the car up to International and spot it on their siding. Sometimes, however, one of the sectionmen would crack the valve on the tank car for a bit and fill up a bucket of wine. In the left-hand photo is number 17 bringing a wine car down to International from temporary storage at Kenilworth. The short train had just crossed the boulevard. The other shot on the right shows number 17 on the International Wines lead, and both shots show engineer Frank Frote at the throttle. The track to International Wines was about 15 car lengths. From the switch, there were about 2 or 3 car lengths of trees on both sides of the track. The track extended for about 10 car lengths before it reached the International's parking area. After that, it traveled next to their building on the east side of the tracks. So this is the Garden State Parkway overpass and the switch for International Wine. Volco Brass was another customer in Kenilworth, and they were a manufacturer of wire and castings. They would ship in carloads of scrap brass and copper. The scrap copper would come loaded in drums and 40-foot boxcars from someplace in the Midwest. It would take Volco a couple of days to unload a boxcar. When they were done, the Rahway Valley train crew would search the car for any leftover scrap metal and sell it to Nork Iron, another Rahway Valley customer in Union, for 16 cents a pound. One day, however, Volco saw them picking up the scrap off the ground and turned them in, even though it was outside their fence line. Occasionally, Volco would get in cars with big cathodes. Chunks would break off and they would leave it, and the crew would do the same thing. So this is Volco's facility on the boulevard. This is looking south. This is currently the Acme parking lot and the car wash over here. Walt Switz tells us there was a little shed of some sort at Volco's private grade crossing, which created a blind crossing. It looked like a section house. So one morning they got their train together to go down the can branch to Monsanto, about 9 cars. We had to shove down the branch so the conductor and brakeman are on the leading car, protecting the move. The brakeman is on the top of the car and the conductor is down below. I'm on the head car by the engine, passing signals. We're shoving, giving. We ease up to Volco's crossing. The building I mentioned was a little ways across the crossing and a guardhouse just inside the fence. We keep going. No sooner does the brakeman give an okay when I see a truck suddenly speeding out from the left. I wave to Frote, the engineer, to stop. He puts the brake on, but the truck cuts across. Next thing, boom. We hit the flatbed and it turned over. The fifth wheel broke apart. We stopped. The guard was a witness. The truck driver was speeding into the parking lot and shouldn't have been. We never got anything out of it, such as monetary damages, but it was a little hairy. The conductor had to bail off. The Papyrus Company was a manufacturer of crepe paper. They would get in carloads of wrapping paper rolled in cannel coal. This type of coal burned very hot and would come in huge chunks, which was burned as part of Papyrus's manufacturing process. It would come in hoppers from somewhere down in West Virginia or West Virginia. A car would come in every couple months. Papyrus would unload the car by dumping it on the ground under the car and loading it into trucks by hand. The car would sit for a few days before it was unloaded. This picture shows number 17 at the Lehigh Valley interchange with the Clinchfield coal hopper. Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp., which is located across from the Kenilworth office, was formerly known as Kenilworth Steel. They were a steel fabricator and would only usually ship in a carload during a trucking strike. C&O boxcars would come in loaded with thin coiled steel. 3 or 4 cars would come in over the course of a few weeks. Once the trucking strike was settled, however, the carloads would stop. Their siding could accommodate about 5 cars between the switch and the company's driveway in front of the roll-up door. The tracks entered the building and there were 2 car spots inside the building. Freight cars had to keep the company's driveway clear so that the trucks could drive around. There was no dedicated siding for the Kenilworth team track. Customers would offload cars wherever there was room. Most often this would be done on Joan and Laughlin siding behind the freight house, back in here. Gilbert Plastics, which was in Kenilworth off the railroad, we used to get in USLX or WR Grace hopper cars with plastic. When their cars were spotted, Gilbert would send a truck and hook a hose up to the car to pump the plastic out. That's what you see here. This is their pumper. Other customers, such as the Mart Furniture Warehouse, would offload their cars on a portion of Volco siding across the street. So after drilling the Kenilworth customers, the train would stop at the office around 1 p.m. to do paperwork. There might be some notes from customers who had called in. If there are any through cars from the C&J or Valley for the EL, the crew would have to take the paperwork to the office and have it stamped as proof that the Rahway Valley handled the cars. Proceeding westbound, in Kenilworth, there were only 2 other customers, France Campbell and Darling and Continental Packaging, which both had facing point switches. So if the train had any cars for them, they'd have to fly the cars past and get them ahead of the locomotive in order to set them out on the way up to Route 22. France Campbell manufactured resins for lacquers and varnishes. They'd receive tank cars and box cars. They would receive about 1 car a week, sometimes more. The tank cars were more often than the box cars. The tanks would be loaded with soybean oil from Central Soya. They would be unloaded at the bottom, curved portion of the siding where the pipes came out of the building. The box cars, usually 40 or 50-foot Southern or Central of Georgia cars, would be loaded with solidified resin in 5 or 10-gallon corrugated drums. The company would unload the drums, knock and peel them apart, and melt the contents down for their purposes. The box cars would be unloaded at a platform along the upper straight section of the siding. So this is the France Campbell siding here. And this is the switch to the Rahway River branch and the main line here in the background. This water tower, which is no longer there, sat atop a hill at the Galloping Hill Golf Course. France Campbell's track was about 6 or 7 car lengths long. It ran along the branch here next to North Michigan Avenue. The siding snaked around the outside of the building to a platform. Tank cars were spotted immediately in the clear of the switch within the 1st or 2nd car lengths. Pipes were utilized to offload the tank cars. After another 3 car lengths, there was a platform alongside the building where box cars were spotted. So proceeding up to Route 22 was Continental Packaging. They were a manufacturer of packing materials. They brought in 40-foot single-door boxcars of rolled paper, usually C&W boxcars. There were 2 loading doors on their building. One door was wider than the other, but the company always wanted boxcars spotted at a smaller, narrower one. Both the door and the metal plate used to connect the building to the boxcar were the exact width of the boxcar. So the door could not be off spot more than a few inches. Otherwise, they couldn't get their plate in. It could take 4 or 5 times to get the boxcar spotted correctly. The company would usually receive 1 or 2 cars per week. Usually the cars came in 1 at a time, but occasionally 2 would arrive at once. So this is Continental's Packaging's siding, and their building is located right back in here. So the train would pull up to Route 22 and stop. There was a three-way switch and a lockbox to manually turn on the crossing flashers at the crossing. The train would cross with a flagman, and the flashers would be turned off manually from another three-way switch on the opposite side. Sometimes the train was long enough that the crew on the head end had to rely on one of the brakemen on the rear end to stop the train. Once clear of the crossing, the brakeman would dump the air on the hind car and the train would stop. Otherwise, the train would pull up down close to the Y switch on the upper end and stop. So next is actually a video of a light engine moving across Route 22. It was taken by either Dan McFadden or Ralph Curcio. And the nice thing about it was actually has live sound. So I don't know if what you guys see, but it looks like the video has paused. So I'm just going to continue on ahead. So once across Route 22, the crew would dump the train and start bleeding off air off of the cars. They would start flat switching and put the cars into 3 blocks in order. So the first block was cars for the North Heights branch. Second block was for cars further west on the main line, such as for Western Electric, Summit, Springfield, and the EL up in Summit. And in the third block would be cars for local customers around the Y. So the crew would, so cars for the North Heights branch would be grouped together, those yellow cars there, and put on the top leg of the Y. If there are cars for the branch that later needed to get ahead of the locomotive, they would be put at the hind end of the block. They'd be shoved around the upper leg of the Y, cut off on the other side of the switch, and the other cars pulled back and tied down on the upper leg. So later in the day, the locomotive would come around the opposite leg from Route 22 and would have the cars ahead and behind it that it needed. So the second block were cars for Western Electric, Springfield, Summit, and the EL, and would be blocked together. They'd be put over onto the top leg of the Y ahead of the North Heights cars. The last car would have its coupler knuckle closed so it wouldn't couple up to the North Heights cars. The crew would alternatively leave those cars on the upper Y leg or take them with them while making local setouts around the Y. So the third cut this third block would be cars for local customers at Branch Junction. These cars would be grouped together into a big block of cars. The locomotive would tuck into the Iorio spur and the block flown past a switch. If there was anything for Gelb, which is located inside the Y, which was occasional, the crew would have to set the block up so that after it was flown past, the crew could couple up to it and grab any cars for Gelb off the hind end. The block could be as many as 12 cars. A brakeman would set the handbrake before Liberty Ave. A single brake could usually slow the cars down. If there were a lot of cars, 2 guys would get on and set 2 brakes. There were a few dips in the track between the Y switch and Liberty Avenue, and the block would stall out if it wasn't going fast enough. So if there was anything for Gelb, the crew had set the block up so that it was flown past. When it was flown past the crew could couple up to it and grab any cars for Gelb off the hind end. The block could be as many as 12 cars. Looks like this is a repeat. So at this point, the crew would alternatively make local setouts from the cut of cars. They just flew or shoved the same cut into the Iorio spur, where there was room to shove in 10 cars. to be dealt with later in the afternoon, as they wouldn't need to switch those places until later anyway, unless there was an empty for the EL. Anything for Gelb, the crew would couple up to it, pull it off the cut, and back down the Y. They'd key the flasher onto Route 22, just the westbound side, and shove the car into Gelb. Once done with switching at Branch Junction, the train would head westbound along the main with its block of Western Electric, Springfield, and EL cars. So at this point, before we leave Branch Junction, it's worth going over the various industries that were located around the Y. And this picture shows number 16 crossing the westbound lanes of Route 22. So the first customer, which was immediately over the crossing, was Foley Machinery. They were a heavy equipment dealer, and they would get in a carload every couple of months, such as a bulldozer or grader spread out over 2 or 3 car shipments. Foley would indicate which car they would want first, as they could only unload 1 car at a time. Sometimes they would unload multiple cars on the same day, but ordinarily it would take a couple of days to uncrate and unblock the equipment. The company would also get in shipments of heavy equipment tires and gondolas or boxcars. Gelb, which I mentioned earlier, dealt in secondhand glass line chemical processing equipment for refurbishment and reuse or for junk. They were located within the Y at Branch Junction, and there was one long private siding for them inside the Y. But occasionally they loaded cars from parts of the Y located nearest the cargo. The Rahway Valley train crew never knew when anything was going to show up for Gelb, as they shipped carloads sporadically, but they always knew which cars were theirs, as they would be loaded with crummy old vessels and tanks of all sizes with pipes and valves sticking out. They'd be loaded on flat cars and gondolas. They were odd-shaped loads and required lots of blocking and tie-downs to prevent the loads from shifting in transit. Occasionally, Gelb would also get a ship out a refurbished piece of equipment. The company never seemed to be in a hurry to load or unload a car. Sometimes it would take 4 or 5 days for them to get ready. As soon as the Y track left the main line was Gelb siding, located right here in the weeds. After that, the track went in for about 4 or 5 car lengths. Cars were usually spotted further down so they could be loaded and offloaded with machinery. According to Walt, the switch was so close to Route 22 that the locomotive's coupler would extend out into the shoulder of the highway when trying to clear the switch. You'd have to turn on the highway flashers on one side of the highway when making a move. You would go in and there was a 2-sided flop over derail, which became my downfall, after about a car length or more from the clearance point. During my first week at the railroad at night, we were about to switch Gelbs, and the conductor asked, "You gonna go in and get it?" I thought he just meant to switch. I didn't know there was a derail. I went in, the brakeman got off, the train starts coming up from the hind end, and I'm looking and looking. The whole place was covered in white gray dust. It looked like there was something on the track. Oh, it's a derail, I thought. I waited for Froth to stop, but he didn't acknowledge me right away, and we went off the derail, putting a pair of wheels on the ground. When we derailed, the footboard got bent, which made George Davis mad. So Nork Iron and Metal was the next customer on one of the Y legs, and they were engaged in obtaining and reselling scrap metals, mostly scrap from dismantled plants and operating industries. They were a busy customer on the railroad, and they would ordinarily receive 2 gondola cars every day, sometimes more, for loading with outbound loads of scrap. Turnings and scrap bales would be loaded. The bales would be loaded on the floor of the gondola, and then extra bales added over the trucks of the cars. Oftentimes, the National Tool or Allied Steel on the Rahway River branch emptied a gondola car. The crew would take the car and respot it at Nork Iron in Union for loading. There were exceptions, however. If National Tool had an EL car, for example, the crew would not use it for that purpose. Scrap metal out of Nork Iron was usually going to the Harrisburg area or somewhere else in Pennsylvania. Therefore, an EL car would be out of route because it was expected to be sent back towards its owner railroad. Nork Iron siding was usually underwater as it was in a low spot. The crew had to be careful not to run off the end of the track as they could not ordinarily see the end of the track. Nork Iron cars usually went via the C&J, but occasionally traveled via the Lehigh Valley. Gondola cars would usually be B&O or PRR. Next customer up the main was Carpenter Steel. They were a manufacturer of alloy steel tubing and piping. They had two sidings, one of which went alongside the building, and the second siding went inside. The company would get in carloads of pipe covered in open gondola cars a couple of times each month. They'd be spotted inside the building for unloading. The covered gondolas carried the more premium stainless steel pipe. The open gondolas would have pipes sitting in it, but they would be bundled and wrapped. Most of the gondolas were from the C&O. For the open gondolas, occasionally the RV would pull it outside once it was unloaded, and Carpenter would load it with scrap pipe or bundled and packaged pipe. Empty gondola cars would be spotted on the outside track and filled up there with pieces of pipe trimmings once every month or 2 months. It would take 3 or 4 days for them to fill up a car with the pipe scrap. So along our Arroyo Court in Union were a number of customers. The first one was Essex Chair, a manufacturer of furniture. They would get in carloads of sticks of lumber wrapped in bundles every 3 months or so. The inbound loads would mostly arrive in 40-foot C&W or Minneapolis and St. Louis boxcars or another Midwestern railroad. They would take a very long time to empty a car, perhaps a week or more. A pair of workers would load up a small dolly by hand, unload it inside, and come back and forth monotonously. If the train crew had to get further in the siding, the crew would have to check to see if anyone was unloading Essex Chair's car or if anyone was sleeping on top of the car, and would tell someone at the company they'd be right back with their car. The crew would close the doors, bleed the air, undo the handbrake, and move it out of the way so the crew could service the rest of the siding. The Rahway Valley could respot the car 2 or 3 times before fully unloaded. The next customer on the siding was William B Levinson. They're a distributor of bulk food products for bakeries, prisons, etc. They received several different types of foodstuffs, such as Pillsbury institutionalized pancake mix, which came palletized in groups of 8 to 10 5-pound bags. They also received bags of cornmeal and flour for bakeries. Most oftentimes, these flour shipments came in 40-foot Buffalo Creek boxcars, but occasionally they came in Lehigh Valley or Yale cars. Levinson would receive an average of 2 cars per day at least, sometimes 3. So they were a heavy customer on the Rahway Valley, but they didn't receive much revenue for each carload of the Rahway Valley. In fact, George Clark used to complain on occasion because Levinson would put in damage claims that would exceed what the Rahway Valley would be paid for the car. Sometimes Levinson required 2 drills per day. They had 2 loading doors and a platform for offloading cars. They preferred to work from the doors, but sometimes had to utilize the platform if that day's shipment was heavy. Sometimes Levinson would want a car switched from the platform to the door. This picture, which was actually taken at Kenilworth, shows number 16 with 2 empty Buffalo Creek boxcars going back outbound. So the next group of customers were all located along Rahway Avenue in Union. The first of which was Danley Machine Specialties, which was located off the top leg of the Y. They were a heavy machinery manufacturer, and they would receive gondolas of sheet steel and gondola cars about once or twice a month. Their siding went inside the building, and the train crew would spot cars inside for unloading. Sometimes Danley would push the car outside when they were finished emptying it. Other times the crew would have to go inside the building to go get it. So the next customer on the Rahway Avenue was actually on the main line. And they were Manning and Lewis Engineering Company, and they were a manufacturer of heat exchangers, copper coils, and heating systems. They shipped out carloads of heat exchangers and heat exchanger parts about once every 3 months or so. Their siding entered the building through a large roll-up door. Next customer was Jersey Tab Card. They were a manufacturer of computer processor cards back when computing was very much in its infancy. They would receive carloads of pulpboard paper rolls, most always in 10,000 class main central 50-foot plug door boxcars. They would get about 1 or 2 carloads per day on average. The train crew would sometimes have to give them a drill twice a day. The Jersey tab siding was good for about 2 or 3 cars. The picture on the right actually shows number 16 at Aldine with an inbound main central car loaded with paper rolls for Jersey tab. Manning and Lewis's siding was at least 10 car lengths long, and it crossed over the Jersey tab siding with a diamond. The Western Electric Annex, which was basically a warehouse, had a platform for 1 car alongside the track. Any car spotted at the platform would foul the diamond. The crew couldn't spot cars for a Jersey tab without moving the annex car out of the way. So this is a Jersey tab siding crossing here. This is Manning and Lewis's siding going past Western Electric, and this is the door for Manning and Lewis right here. And this is further back. You can see the Western Electric platform and Jersey tab siding right here. So the next customer along Rahway Avenue was Baxter Warehouse. They were an alcohol distribution warehouse. They would receive carloads of wine in insulated boxcars or reefers, but with the refrigeration equipment missing or not running. And they were used purely for their insulated properties, not necessarily the coolant. Cars would usually be from Western railroads such as Western Pacific, Southern Pacific, or Santa Fe, for example. The company would usually only receive carload shipments seasonally, about a month or so before a major holiday. 2 or 3 cars a week would arrive for a month, and then the business would disappear until the next holiday. So this is looking at their siding, curving in along their building. They had about 6 car lengths of space, but there were 2 car spots, and you can see their car loading doors here. The next Rahway Avenue customer was Simpson Timber. They were a lumber distribution warehouse. Their siding could only unload 2 cars at a time, but their yard gave the railroad a very large volume of business. They would bring in 5 to 10 carloads of lumber in a week. Sometimes as many as 3 to 4 cars a day would arrive on the railroad. There could be 5 to 6 cars sitting in a string on their siding with 2 cars on spot and the rest off spot. The Rahway Valley would have to drill the siding frequently as Simpson unloaded the cars and needed fresh carloads to offload at their location. These cars would be full of dimensional lumber and plywood. This was Simpson Timber siding. It could only accommodate 5 40-foot cars. The company could only unload the rearmost 2 cars in their yard. The 3 cars closest to the switch would be left hanging, and the crew would have to drill the siding and respot cars for further unloading. The track was most always full. Simpson unloaded cars from the ground with forklifts. The company had a small forklift and a big forklift, and they'd open the car, clear the doorway with the big forklift, and afterward, the big one would lift the small one into the car for unloading. Once inside, the forklift would feed the large one with material to unload. When 50-foot cars started coming in, it really crippled Simpson. If the siding had a 40 and a 50 in the unloading area, they could only barely reach the doorway of the second car. If there were 2 50-footers, the company could only unload 1 car because the doorway of the second car wouldn't clear the neighboring building. The train crew would have to arrange 40 and 50-foot cars in such a way that Simpson could unload 2 at a time. So once with Simpson, they actually called the Kenilworth office and said that their cars were going to be empty. The crew pulled them, and the office got a call the next morning saying their forklift was still in the car, or that they weren't finished unloading, but the doors were closed and they reported it empty. So the last customer in the Rahway Avenue stretch was Harry Rich Affiliates. They were a contractor that installed commercial floor and ceiling coverings and also did acoustical contracting, basically making sound booths. The company would receive 1 or 2 cars every month or so. They would get 50-foot Frisco or Missouri Pacific boxcars loaded with gypsum ceiling panels. They would also occasionally receive a carload of iron or steel studding used to hang the gypsum steel ceiling panels. So the Harry Rich siding could accommodate 5 cars, but there were only 2 car spots with unloading doors. The first door was the one usually used. The second door would only be used if there was a second car came in. So proceeding further westbound along the main, the next customer was Western Electric on the opposite side of Liberty Avenue. A setup would be made for them if the crew had any cars for them. So Western Electric was a electrical engineering and manufacturing company that served as the primary hardware supplier to AT&T and the local Bell operating companies. So Western Electric brought in carloads of scrap electronic equipment in bins and also reels of heavy copper cable. These loads usually arrived in 50-foot 299 class Baltimore and Ohio boxcars or captive service Milwaukee ribside boxcars. They also shipped outbound loads of various scrap metals, mostly foam parts and wire, to Nassau Smelting and Refining in Tottenville, New York on Staten Island. There were 3 car spots for unloading and unloading cars. The first was on a curve, the second and third straightened out. Western always wanted cars at the first and second car spots. The siding was behind a lock fence that the crew was required to open and close each time the plant required a drill. If there were more than 2 cars, the Rahway Valley couldn't leave it between the fence and the driveway as they'd foul the driveway. They also couldn't be left between the fence and the switch for fear of vandalism. So Western would get 4 or 5 cars in each week. They usually came in 2 at a time, but sometimes in 3s. 3 cars would come in on a Monday, but Western Electric would only want to take 2, which would leave 1 car hanging someplace because they wouldn't want to utilize their third door. So they may not work these 2 cars until Wednesday, and then the Rahway Valley would drill them again. By that time, another car may have come in for them. The crew might only drill Western Electric 2 or 3 days a week, but will receive 4 or 5 cars. Just a quick side note, my grandfather worked at Western Electric for many years. So proceeding further west, the train would cross Springfield at the Rahway River Bridge and approach Mizell Avenue. This was the only grade crossing on the railroad with automatic flashers. Sometimes, especially after a weekend or when it rained, the flashers would malfunction. The crew would see them activate, then stop, and then activate again because the train was making and breaking contact due to rust on the rail. So the crew would have to be careful. George Davis instructed the crew to stop and flag the crossing if the flashers weren't seen to be working. If they were working properly, the train could proceed without stopping. So now we get up into Springfield, where the railroad had its only runaround track. The team track, Best Pencil and Scheibel Oil were also located at Springfield proper. So the team track could accommodate about 4 cars. The team track served a few different customers. There was Boychuk Stone Company, which received flat cars of stone, pieces of slate stacked up and sometimes bundled and palletized fireplace stone. Andrew Wilson took delivery of pesticides at the team track. Columbia Lumber would receive carloads of 2x4s or plywood and single door boxcars. There was actually a bit of a grade on the team track, which you can see here. The boxcar back here is spotted on the team track. On one occasion, the crew spotted a boxcar up there and cut away from it, and it started following them back out. The crew looked and saw that the handbrake was cranked all the way on and the pistons all the way out, but the brake shoes were still hanging loose. George Davis had to come up and adjust the brakes. In the meantime, the crew had to double and triple chock the car and leave a car ahead of it so it wouldn't roll out. Next customer, the Richard Best Pencil Company, which manufactured pencils in this building here to the right, received carloads of cedar sticks measuring 1x2 every 2 or 3 months. The cedar sticks would be stacked to the roof of the boxcar. They had a doorway facing the railroad. The crew would spot cars for them at the upper end of the runaround track here in the weeds at Springfield. This would cause extra steps for the crew when switching at Springfield. The boxcar could be there for a week or so while it was unloaded. Their materials came from someplace in the Pacific Northwest, so their inbound loads usually came in 40-foot Great Northern or Northern Pacific boxcars or something similar. At Springfield, the locomotive would run around any inbound cars for Scheibel Oil across the street, Carter Bell up on the mountain, or Stevens Miller in Summit. Setouts would be made in any cars from Springfield heading back eastbound to the CNJ or LV would be blocked together and left on the runaround to be picked up later. So across the street was Scheibel Oil. They dealt in fuel oil as well as automotive oil and lubricants. They brought in carloads of Pennzoil in 50-foot boxcars, PRR boxcars, and fuel oil in green and yellow GACX tank cars from Oil City, Pennsylvania. They would get a car every month or so. Their track was only good for a couple of car lengths. The track had gone in further at one time to a coal dock, but stuff was piled on the track. Scheibel always wanted their cars just barely past the clearance point beyond the derail. So these snapshots were taken at Springfield and show number 16 in July of 1966. These shots were taken by Richie King, who works at the Mars Santa Erie. In the cab window, you can see Walt Switz sitting on what must have been a hot day. So interestingly enough, years later, Campana and Switz worked together on the M&E and when they started operations at Bayway Refinery some 30 years later. So leaving Springfield, the train would begin climbing the steep grade to Summit. Hoodale Construction Materials up on the mountain at the old quarry would receive carloads of cement to mix at their batch plant. The cars were heavy, so sometimes the crew would double the hill. They'd take the cement cars up to Hoodie, come back down, and then make the trip up the hill with the balance of the cars. Very, very rarely, George Davis and a sectionman would ride up in the second locomotive and give the train a push up the grade and remove the need to double the hill. So this picture that Walt Switz took shows the train climbing the mountain west of Baltusrol. George Matz is riding the hind car. It was a general rule that a brakeman rode all hind cars as protection if the car became uncoupled or got loose. That was a rule that was usually followed. The covered hoppers were for Hoodie in this train. The L&N boxcar was from Monsanto. The EL boxcar was from Griffith Labs. The flat car was from Binder or Foley. And you could also see chocks on the deck. The Northern Pacific empty was from Simpson Timber, and the main central car was from Jersey Tab Card. So speaking of George Matz, one time an empty flat car from Boyd Chuckstone at the Springfield team track was picked up. It had wood stakes in its pockets padded with an Excelsior wrapping and was coupled to the hind end of the train. Matz lit the Excelsior with his lighter while riding the car and was whooping it up. As it burned, looking back down the hill, fires broke out in the brush along the tracks as the Excelsior dropped off. George Clark reamed out the crew. Matz's crew must have been a stuck brake. The fire companies got on the Rahway Valley for tall weeds along the right-of-way, saying they should have been cut. This whole spectacle really tickled engineer Frank Frode. So just a quick note with the snow that we just had. A note on operations in the snow and on the mountain in particular. The Rahway Valley actually had a snowplow in the engine house that fit the 70-tonners. They didn't use it much as it was a pain to install. George Davis would have to remove the pilot steps and bolt it in place. One time, following a heavy snow, they put it on a diesel and used it to plow the line up to Summit. They ended up bucking the snow, hitting the drifts, and backing up repeatedly. It didn't work so good on the grade beyond Springfield. The 70-tonners just weren't heavy enough. On at least one occasion, the 70-tonners were double-headed up the mountain to plow the snow. So heading up the mountain, the first customer they would encounter was Carter Bell in Springfield. So any cars for Carter Bell in Springfield or Stevens Miller in Summit would be on the head end of the locomotive and be shoved into their sidings on the train's way up towards Summit. So Carter Bell manufactured rubber substitutes. They received soybean oil and rubber filler in 8,000-gallon tank cars. Pipes came out of the rear of the building to unload the tank cars and also heat them. They would also ship out drums and 50-foot Lehigh Valley insulated boxcars, either green or white cars. The company would take 2 or 3 days to load up a boxcar. Carter Bell would get about 2 or 3 cars a month. So Carter Bell's track went in for a couple of car lengths, and there was a switch for a reverse track for a coal pocket, which was slowly disappeared in the 60s. Beyond that, there were another 5 or 6 car lengths to Carter Bell's building. There were 2 doors for boxcar loading and a pipe that came out of the building used to unload tank cars. So proceeding further up the grade, up the mountain, crossing over Shunpike Road, was Houdel Construction Materials, and they occupied the site of the former Commonwealth Stone Quarry. Stone was no longer shipped by rail after 1940 or 41, going by truck afterwards. But as the construction of highways, roadways, and homes required bulk shipments of cement, a batch cement was set up alongside the old quarry siding. The Rahway Valley would bring in carloads of cement that came in from the Cement Belt region of Pennsylvania, along the C&J and L&E railroads, from Dragon Cement in Siegfried, Pennsylvania, for example. These cars were normally 2-bay covered hoppers and always came in from the C&J at Aldine. A long siding curved into the quarry under a cement loader. Cars would come in about 3 times a week. Sometimes a car would get 2 or 3 cars at a time. Other times it'd just be 1 car. On average, a Monday might see 3 cars, and on Wednesday or Thursday, 2 cars might come in. The quarries was good for about an average of about a car a day. So this picture here, taken before Walt's time, when steam was still king, shows the quarry siding that curved up a grade, and you can see the batch cement plant in the background. So the Rahway Valley would continue climbing across into Summit, and the next customer that they would hit would be Stevens Miller. Stevens Miller was a fuel and building supply dealer. The company shipped in coal, gravel, sand, and bagged cement. The first track was alongside the Rahway Valley, right here, and served the lumber shed. Dimensional lumber and plywood would arrive in 40-foot box cars from the Pacific Northwest, mostly Northern Pacific and GN cars. Once in a while, there'd be a Santa Fe car. A lumber car would come in about once a month. The middle track was on the ground level and was partially buried, so it wasn't really used. This one right here. The third track traveled up a coal trestle measuring about 20 feet above ground level. Sand, gravel, and coal hoppers would be spotted up on the trestle to be dumped into the chute. Those cars would come in about 2 to 3 times a week. Oftentimes, Stevens Miller would want a lumber car spotted for unloading where it would foul the track for the trestle. So when a car came in for the trestle came in, the crew would have to move it out of the way and then respot it. The trestle track could hold about 8 cars. The end pits held sand, then further down was gravel, then coal. Someone from the company would tie a rag on the handrail where they'd want a car spotted. After making the cut, the Rahway Valley crew member would have to walk back inside the dark trestle on a couple of 2x10 planks 20 feet above ground level. Not a very fun task. So after that was the last customer on the main. The crew would usually get up the hill and to Summit on the Erie-Lackawanna about 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon. Typically, the RV would have 4 or 5 outbound cars at that point to be conveyed to the EL. The Rahway Valley would pull up there into either the wall track, the interchange track, or track 1, whichever one had enough headroom, and then shove their outbound cars into the whole track, which is right here. The whole track was the remnants of an old spur that once served Eastern Fuel Company. The whole track could accommodate about 8 or 9 cars at most. Past that, the track wasn't really usable. The whole track was shortened up to just about where the curve was by the cat pole. Most of the time when the Rahway Valley came up to Summit, the whole track was empty. Occasionally the EL would use the whole track for something else. So sometimes they'd have to set their own stuff in there. Sometimes they'd have their own stuff set in there, or there was track machinery, or they would have a bad order car in there that just had to be set off, and the Rahway Valley couldn't move it. In this case, the Rahway Valley crew would have to make other arrangements. But typically, after outbounds were spotted in the hole, the Rahway Valley locomotive would run light up a clear track to the dwarf signal and stop. The conductor would disembark the train and go to exchange waybills with the agent. Originally, the conductor would go into the bottom of the main station building to get the waybills. There was a small dungeon-like room that the agent worked out of. The agent was not full-time at this point and worked out of Morristown, as there was not much freight business on the EL around Summit. The agent would be in there in the afternoon until a certain time, and then he would leave. If the Rahway Valley got up there really late, the agent would just bring the waybills to the tower and leave them with the operator. Later on, the EL closed this little office in the station entirely, and anytime the Rahway Valley crew needed their paperwork, they would go right to the tower. Sometimes the operator would lower the paperwork down to the Rahway Valley crew on a spring clip attached to a string. Sometimes when the Rahway Valley crew would get up to Summit, there would be a message for them from the Kenilworth office. Walt Switz tells us there were no working radios on the Rahway Valley during my time there. Sometimes a message would come into the Kenilworth office for us. Bob Clark would generally know about where we were during the course of the day and would call up one of the customers asking, "Can you give my crew a message?" For example, we'd be working at Simpson Timber and some guy would come out with a note that our office had called. Sometimes we get up to Summit on the EL and the tower operator or the agent would say, "Your office gave me this message for you," which is this message that you see here on your screen. There was no way for us to check in with the office throughout the day. Occasionally, George Davis would be out on the line doing track work and he'd flag us down and have a message for us. The P&D drill would have spotted the Rahway Valley's inbound cars in the yard. The P&D local was based out of Croxton Yard. Most of the time, the P&D left the Rahway Valley's cars on the interchange track, but it was dependent on what work the P&D crew had to do when they got up to Summit. Sometimes they had to set off cars for Summit proper, or they would want to rearrange their train before they went down the branch to Gladstone. So the P&D would work with the operator. They would tell the operator, "We want to go here, we want to go there." As long as they had the room between the passenger trains and the wall track, they would switch their stuff around a little bit. The P&D might spend half an hour switching. So sometimes the P&D might leave the Rahway Valley's inbound cars on track 1. Oftentimes the P&D would drop off the Rahway Valley's inbounds and be gone down the branch to Gladstone by the time the Rahway Valley got up there to make a pickup. The P&D would then pick up the Rahway Valley's outbound cars on its return to Croxton. There were times that the Rahway Valley would train and get there and the P&D had not made its drop off yet. The operator at the tower would say the P&D will be here in about half an hour. The Rahway Valley crew would wait up in the tower for the P&D. The P&D would eventually show up and make its move, set off the Rahway Valley cars, and the P&D would get its train together and go on its way down to Gladstone. After paperwork was obtained and outbound cars were spotted, the Rahway Valley engine would back down the clear track light, pull up to the track where the inbounds were spotted, and couple up. The crew would inspect the cars and make their chalk marks. After that was done, the crew would take their handbrakes off. Typically, there would be about 4 or 5 inbound cars. The Rahway Valley train would pull them out, back down to their own track, and restore the switch for the whole track to keep any runaway cars off the Rahway Valley. There was a double-ended flop-over derail on the Rahway Valley's track just past the whole track switch. This was to protect the Rahway Valley against runaways off the EL, which did happen. The Rahway Valley crews used to leave it off, and there was no lock on it. After a while, someone must have seen that the derail was not on, so they called the Rahway Valley office in Kenilworth to complain that the derail was off. The response was, the guys must have put it on, but there was no lock, so the kids probably put it off, which was the usual excuse. After that, the Rahway Valley crews would have to expect to find the derail on. Sometimes the crew would get up to Summit and things would not be the norm. Occasionally, the whole track would be out of service for whatever reason. If not told beforehand, the Rahway Valley's conductor would have to go up to the tower operator and make some sort of arrangement. For example, the Rahway Valley train would pull its outbound cars through the wall track to the west end. Frote would give a few blasts on the horn. There were no radios, and the tower operator would see the locomotive and line it into the station. The operator would hold a cleared signal for the Rahway Valley, and they would proceed up into the station area on the P&D wall track. The operator would line the Rahway Valley train, which would then reverse and shove the outbound cars into the interchange track against the inbound cars. The Rahway Valley engine would then run light around the train, back through the wall track, come in the other end of the interchange track, and take its inbound cars and leave. The outbound cars would be on the interchange track, so when the P&D came back, the P&D would have to be able to grab the outbound cars and move them. On at least one occasion, the Rahway Valley had to make a move out on the main. The whole track was blocked by something was out of service. The Rahway Valley had too many cars to double up the outbound and inbound cars on the interchange track at the same time. The Rahway Valley pulled up the wall track, the only clear track, to the dwarf signal and stopped. One of the crew went up to the tower and got permission to make a move out on the main. The operator gave them keys for the crossover on the lower end by the whole track. The Rahway Valley cut their outbound cars off on the wall track. The operator gave them a clear signal and they ran up along the P&D wall track through and past the station. The Rahway Valley cleared the interlocking and was switched over on the main track too. The Rahway Valley engine backed down the main, went back through the station, continued down the main and around the bend. The crew opened the hand crossover switches, closed it up after they passed through it, and went back against their inbound cars on the interchange track. Then the conductor had to walk back to the tower to give the operator his keys, because the Rahway Valley did not have keys for the crossover. Occasionally, the Rahway Valley crews would get up to Summit very late and the yard would be full. The MUs would fill up the yard, as that is where they were stored overnight. The Rahway Valley would shove their outbound cars into the hole first, piecing over the train if there was not enough headroom. Then the Rahway Valley would pull up to their inbound cars and couple against it. Then the conductor would have to walk through the tracks to get up to the tower to exchange waybills and walk back again. Clearances were very close in this yard and the crew would almost have to walk sideways between the cars. Walt Switz tells us that one time we picked up a PRR 40-foot boxcar for Volco, a load of scrap copper at the EL interchange. After getting our bills, we headed down, passing through Kenilworth. George Clark came out of the station to meet the train. He said, "I'm glad you made it. I thought I'd get a call from the police saying you guys were lying dead in the street and the Summit Bridge had collapsed over Broad Street." The EL had listed the wrong weight for the car on the bill. It was 10 tons over, and overweight for the Broad Street Bridge. It creaked a little bit to come to think of it. After normalizing everything in Summit, the Rahway Valley would depart the interchange and head back down the hill. They never left with anything ahead of the locomotive while heading down grade. On the way down, the crew might have to pick up an outbound car from Stevens Miller or Carter Bell. So a note on overhead car movements between the EL and the Lehigh Valley. Walt Switz tells us, while I was working at the Rahway Valley, sorry about that. While I was working at the Rahway Valley, a couple times we received a big cut of empty tank cars at the EL interchange at Summit that had been moved down from E.F. Drew Chemical Company and down to Lehigh Valley at Roselle Park. I think one came in a 12-car block and the other move came in a 9-car block. We didn't get any revenue out of the move because they were moving empty. At that time, you had to pay a certain number of cents per car per mile as a rebate for the benefit of having handled the load. Tank cars, for the most part, were returned via the same route. So if you handled it loaded going to a consignee, the billing would be arranged to return the cars via the reverse route. So that way, the way it came to you was the way it went back. However, in the case of the Drew cars, the Rahway Valley had to pay the mileage, but got no revenue because they were empty cars. George Clark was really pissed about that. When Clarky was doing the stamping for the interchange at the Kenilworth office, marking the date and time handled and stuff, he almost broke the stamp from slamming it down so hard on the desk and cursing the whole while. That was an exceptional move for us. I can't remember exactly where the Drew cars were going other than I guess they were going someplace to be cleaned and reassigned. They were included in our normal EL interchange and there wouldn't be an extra move run for them. They pretty much filled the yard up in Summit. Thankfully, both times we got to Summit early enough in the day that didn't bog up things so much for the EL. The second time we moved them, we were pulling into the Valley Yard at Roselle Park on that curve when one of the cars derailed. It had been a relatively early day, so we anticipated getting done early at a decent hour. And it was still daylight, but now we had to stop, find a phone, call George Clark, and he had to send George Davis out to help us. We spent a little time getting things re-railed. Those cars were just a big pain to handle. So this film clip shows the Rahway Valley making the drill at the EL interchange. The 16 shoves an outbound load down into the whole track and proceeds up into the yard to get its pickup, and then proceeds back to home rails. So the train would arrive back in Springfield proper. Other than a car to go in or out of Scheibel, the train would go down to the east end of the runaround to line up as much of the train as possible. The train would be organized into 3 blocks with the crew folding in any cars laying around the runaround that had been left earlier in the day. Outbound C&J cars would be at the rear of the train. The outbound Lehigh Valleys and anything from the EL that had to be set off at Union or go up to Newark Heights branch would be positioned in the rear, would be positioned in the train wherever germane to the situation. The train would proceed eastbound from Springfield. There might be a pickup or set out for Western Electric, which would be handled along the way. The train would cross Liberty Avenue and reach Branch Junction again. The crew might set themselves up to go right up to Branch or do some local work around the Y first, perhaps spotting cars left on the Iorio spur earlier in the day, or any cars that came off the EL. Depending on what cars the train had with it, outbound Lehigh Valleys and C&Js, inbound ELs, and what work it needed to be done on the branch, as well as what was expected to come back off the branch, sometimes the crew left everything at the upper Y switch. Other times the crew might split the Lehigh and Valley and C&J cars with the Lehigh Valley block below the switch and the C&J block left above. In this way, when the train would come back around the Y later from the branch, everything could be matched in and the train would fall together. After staging its cars, the locomotive would cut off and run around the Y light. The locomotive would end up on the northeastern Y switch on the branch between the cuts of cars left there earlier in the day from the C&J and Lehigh Valley. Cars would be ahead of and behind the locomotive, organized based on the direction of the customer's switch. If there were any EL cars that needed to be grabbed, the train would back down and grab those cars off the main line. According to Walt Switz, for a story take at the Y, I worked with a couple of Donalds while I was there. One was George Matz's brother-in-law, the brakeman I'd been working with. Donald wasn't cut out for railroading, and he only lasted a couple of weeks, I think. He was one who couldn't fathom more than one move at a time. One time we were at the Y, he was riding the top of a car, shoving to go up against another car. His brother-in-law is telling him, before the cars couple up, jump up in the air so he won't be thrown off while the cars couple together. Well, his timing was a little off. He was jumping up and down, and then boom, over he went. So with their train together, the crew would proceed down the Newark Heights branch. They would drill the various customers and do it in a sequence to keep their outbound C&J and Lehigh Valley cars blocked together. If there were any EL cars, those would be gathered together and set off someplace to be picked up the following day. So the first customers that they would encounter, Industrial Plywood and Gordon Bass, shared the same building. Industrial Plywood, which was originally called Bosman and Kassan, would receive 2 or 3 cars a day and was one of the Rahway Valley's heaviest customers in the mid-60s. Inbound carloads would consist of 2x4s, plywoods, etc. from the Pacific Northwest, typically an SP or an NP 40-foot boxcars, or other road names from that region of the country. Very rarely a 50-foot boxcar would come in for them, but this was not usually the norm because the Rahway Valley was afraid to handle 80-ton cars. Gordon Bass and Company was a liquor distributor and brought in carloads of alcoholic liquors from Hiram Walker in nickel plate or Norfolk and Western 50-foot plug double-door boxcars. 2 would fit behind their fence. 1 or 2 cars would arrive each week. On average, 2 cars would arrive at a time, but if Bass wasn't ready to take delivery or had no room on their siding, the Rahway Valley would hold the car next to or inside the engine house at Kenilworth. Once the railroad would spot the car on their siding, Bass would place triple arms on the car to protect it against vandalism or pilferage. So this picture taken at Kenilworth shows a boxcar being spotted inside the engine house for safekeeping. So Binder Machinery, who's the next customer, was a dealer for Bucyrus Erie cranes, excavators, and shovels. Binder would get rail shipments every month or 2. They would receive big cranes on flat cars and 2 or 3 car shipments. Occasionally there'd be a drop-end gondola in the shipment. One car would have the main crane body, one the boom, and the others would have accessories like treads and such. Sometimes there'd be idler cars between the loaded flat cars to accommodate for the boom and the extensions. Binder's siding was only 2 car lengths long, so the shipment would have to be unloaded piecemeal. Binder would instruct the train crew as to which cars they wanted to offload first. George Clark would instruct the crew to pull out the idler cars as soon as possible, so demurrage wouldn't have to be paid on them. Most of Binder's shipments came out of Peoria, Illinois, and cars would normally be nickel plate road or something similar. In this photograph, the remnants of the Binder siding can be seen on the left. To the right, where the switch timbers are, right over here, is where the industrial plywood and Gordon Bass siding was. The next customer, located right across the tracks, was Griffith Labs. They were manufacturing seasonings and other food ingredients, and actually locals still to this day call the factory the Spice Factory. Griffith would receive carloads of bagged salt from the Morton Salt Company and Diamond Crystal Salt Company in Michigan in Canadian National or nickel plate road cars. They'd also receive carloads of bagged cornmeal in Missouri Pacific 50-foot boxcars. The company was serviced 5 days a week by the Rahway Valley. They would normally get 2 or 3 cars in at a time, with 2 cars ordinarily spotted on their siding. There were 3 loading doors alongside the siding, but the third, furthest door was not typically used and was ordinarily blocked off. So the crew usually spotted cars at the first 2 doors, and if the Rahway Valley took in more than 2 cars in a day, Griffith would tell the railroad which cars they wanted immediately, and the other cars would be kept somewhere else until they were ready for them. The Rahway Valley always seemed to have 1 or 2 cars on hand for Griffith, waiting to be spotted on their siding. So heading up the branch, we would get to Unionberry, which is located on Morris Avenue. The crew would stop in to see Tom Miller, the freight agent there. The switch for the team track was on the embankment, which climbed to the Morris Avenue Bridge. The track descended to street level and ran alongside International Paint's fence line and the Unionberry Freight House. The railroad's narrow property had a driveway for trucks to drive up and unload freight cars. In the mid-1960s, Culligan Water Softening, located on Route 22, was the most frequent patron of the team track. The company would receive 40-foot Wabash, Port Huron and Detroit, or NJI&I boxcars, loaded with bagged water softener pellets. The company provided the railroad with a fairly good business and would receive about 2 carloads per week. The local water supply in Union was, and as I can attest, remains very hard. Culligan would make a lot of claims for damaged goods. George Clark blamed Culligan for damage as they would accidentally rip bags during the unloading process at Unionberry. The railroad would bring them to Kenilworth Freight House, and Clark would sell them to reclaim the loss for the Rahway Valley. Sometimes train crew members would buy the bags cheap from the Rahway Valley. Mart Furniture Galleries also sometimes get in a carload of furniture at the team track before they move into their facility on Rahway Avenue with its own siding. So the next customer on Morris Avenue was Jaeger Lumber. They were a building supply yard. They're still located there today. The company would receive carloads of lumber about 3 or 4 times a month. They would be either open flat cars of bundled lumber or double door 50-foot box cars. Jaeger siding could accommodate about 3 cars before it disappeared into the dirt. So Elastic Stop Nut was up on Vauxhall Road, more often referred to as ESNA by locals. They were a manufacturer of lock nuts. The company would get a carload in about every 2 months of hex rods in covered gondolas to be machined into stop nuts. Those cars would be spotted inside the building, and there would be there a day or two before being taken out. More often, ESNA would receive empty gondola cars for loading with metal turnings located outside the building. The scrap turnings would be shipped out to Pennsylvania for melting, sometimes to Bethlehem Steel. Most gondola cars would be B&O and PRR cars. Most of the times, these cars came in off the Lehigh Valley. For whatever reason, it was easier to get empty gondola cars off the Lehigh Valley, who would leave 3 or 4 gondola cars at Roselle Park for this purpose. The Rahway Valley crew would take cars up to ESNA from Roselle Park as they were needed. However, ESNA needed cars with a good floor. The Rahway Valley would bring the car up to ESNA and they would look at it. If the floor wasn't too bad, they'd get pieces of plywood, cardboard, or scrap wood to cover the holes in the floor so the turnings wouldn't seep through once they were loaded. If the floor was too bad, ESNA would reject the cars, so the Rahway Valley would visually inspect at Roselle Park and reject them themselves. Every tiny little hole in the gondola would have sharp metal turnings seep through, which would oftentimes end up in the gloves of the RV crew. ESNA would load the cars themselves and move the cars down towards the derail as they loaded it. They would load the turnings up to and above the side rails. Occasionally, they would lose a car and it would hop over the derail, and George Clark would be pissed. So this is the branch here. Doesn't show the facility too great, but here's the siding into ESNA, and this is a corner of the building where the track entered into the building. Opposite the branch still on Vauxhall Road was the Falk Coal Company. They were a coal and fuel oil dealer located on Vauxhall Road in Union. Falk would receive a carload or 2 of coal per week in 2 bay hoppers. The Rahway Valley would spot the cars and wouldn't handle them again for a week or so. Another car might arrive in the meantime. Occasionally, a car from Kingston Coal, further up the branch on Stanley Terrace, would be resold to Falk. The Rahway Valley would grab Kingston's car, flip it to the other side of the engine, and respot it at Falk. The cars were typically Norfolk and Western B&O and C&O cars. The Falk siding had about 2 car lengths of space from the switch to the gate, then 2 or more car lengths before reaching the coal dumper, which had room for 2 cars. J.L. Hammett Co. on the other side of Vauxhall Road was a distribution warehouse for school supplies. Hammett would mostly receive shipments of paper rolls and BAR cars and occasionally an MEC car. The company also received carloads of pulpboard rolls used for the covers of notepads. These would arrive in Southern, Central of Georgia, and Seaboard Airline cars. Hammett would receive about 3 paper cars for every pulpboard car. There were about 3 car lengths of track on their siding from the switch to the gate. The first building had 3 car spots located on the curve of the siding. The unloading platforms were tapered to follow the curvature of the siding. Usually, only the second and third platforms were used. The track ran beyond the first building for about 4 car lengths to the next building, which wasn't used in later years. So these pictures show the Hammett switch as it leads off of the warehouse. And also, here's the rear of Hammett's building. This is one of the loading platforms after it had been disused and blocked up. So this is a BAR boxcar of paper bound for Hammett that Switz photographed at Aldine in July 1966. Note the RV chalked on the right-hand side of the car. So as we're drilling along here, a few quick notes about the guys Walt worked with. So Frank Frote was still the engineer when Walt Switz worked at the Rahway Valley. He was into his late 60s and had over 30 years of experience with the railroad. His years of service had somewhat worn down his finesse a bit. So he would couple hard and was constantly being told by Davis that he didn't use the bell or blow the horn correctly at crossings. He wore the same overalls each day and had long johns all year round. Walt said he was not the best engineer he worked with, but certainly not the worst. One time when they were at Hammett's, which we just talked about, they were going to fly a car and the engine came up and stopped. The crew unlocked the gate and wound off the handbrake. They gave the come ahead signal, but there was no response. Upon looking, Frank was asleep on the armrest. "Wake up, Frank," they shouted. He woke up and gave a little smile and a laugh. Some days the crew would want to try something different in the switching moves, and Frank would argue, "That's not the way we always do it." The engines always pointed towards Summit because Frank would say, "We never did it that way before." And if challenged on his style, he'd threaten, "I'll tell Davis on you." Frote did not like change, and he would tell Davis. Davis would pull the crew member aside and tell them not to change stuff and don't upset Frank. Just do it the way we always do it. Speaking of George Davis, he was a hyper kind of guy. He was always moving fast. He felt he knew how to do stuff and everyone else should know how too. He had no patience and kind of went off easy. He would ride the pilot of the engine to make a coupling, holding on to the pilot with one hand and lining up the coupler with the other, facing towards the car, all while waving hand signals to Frote in a jerky manner. One time a hopper derailed and almost tipped over. With only blocking and jacks, Davis was able to get it back on the tracks. He really knew his stuff. So back to drilling the branch. Kingston Coal Company was the next customer up on Stanley Terrace. They are a fuel and building supply yard located on Stanley Terrace in Union. The company received a couple carloads of coal per week. There were about 4 or 5 car lengths of track between the switch to the top of the coal trestle, then 3 car lengths on the trestle. Also in this aerial shot, you'll see Monmouth Paper, which is a distribution warehouse for paper products. They would get 40-foot main central cars, about 3 or 4 at a time. At that time, the crew couldn't tell where the siding ended because it was filled in. The crew could only fit 3 or 4 car lengths. The unloading platform was crumbling away and the usable section could only accommodate 2 car lengths. The company would drop in a flat plate so they could get into the cars from the platform. So the Rahway Valley would place 2 cars on spot and 2 cars off spot late in the afternoon. Then, however, the crew would have to make a run up to Monmouth Paper first thing in the morning to reposition the cars and pick up the other 2, which would kill about an hour or an hour and a half worth of time. They weren't supposed to, but Monmouth Paper would sometimes roll the 3rd car down on their own and ended up fouling the switch. The Rahway Valley crew would come up and have to pull the car past the switch. Walt Switz snapped this photo of a Virginian hopper number 24453 at the EL interchange in June 1966. It was an inbound load of coal for Kingston on the North Heights branch. The battered gondola on the left was an overhead carload of scrap for the C&J at Eport. So the very last customer on the North Heights branch, and the only one still left in Maplewood at this time, was Maplewood Building Specialties. They were located on Tuscan Road and their property backed up to the branch. The company were receiving carloads of slate, sidewalk stones, most always loaded on a Louisville and Nashville flat car, or occasionally a box car, every 3 months or so. The slate would come in from somewhere in the south. The train crew would shove the car up from Union to an area with Belgian blocks. One time, in this picture actually, when a boxcar slate came in, the car derailed and it was being shoved to Maplewood. The car was so heavy, about 40 tons, and the track conditions so poor that the company had to cut in a trail through the brush to unload the car because it couldn't be re-railed. Once it was unloaded, the Rahway Valley was actually able to successfully re-rail the car. On the branch, sometimes there would be little work to do past Esna. Walt Switz said he would drop off there if they had an empty car to go out. He'd grab the waybill, bleed off the air, and let it roll down towards Branch Junction. I'd ride on top by the handbrake and control the car's. If we were going to do more work in the area, I'd come down so far and stop the car. Later, Froat and the rest of the crew would come down with the engine and whatever cars they had to go up against the car I rode down on, and shove it the rest of the way up to the Y. Other times, I'd stop the car to see if Jaeger or the team track had any pickups. If they did, I'd lay a stick or a rock on the track. Then, taking the waybills, I would ride the car down to the Y and check for other pickups and to start paperwork. Nothing would be on the upper Y leg, so I'd ride all the way down to the main line. I'd reline the Y switch for the crew. There was a hump in the upper leg Y leg near the Danley switch, so you'd have to get the cars up so far or else they'd start rolling back at you. The train crew, returning from Maplewood End, would see my signal and make the pickups necessary. They'd eventually meet me down at the Y. This whole process would save on time. So on average, about 5 or 6 cars were handled on the Newark Heights branch each day. On Mondays, which was the busiest day, there might be as many as 10 or 12 cars. There could be 3 or 4 cars for Griffith, 2 or 3 from industrial plywood, and 1 for the team track, 1 for elastic stop nut, and 2 for Hammett, and 2 for Kingston. So this picture taken in the 50s shows number 17 and the caboose back when they had it, crossing over Morris Avenue in Union. After drilling the branch, the train would arrive back at Branch Junction and the outbounds off the branch would be matched in together with the cars left on the main. The train coming off the branch would be organized as best as possible so that upon arriving back at the Y, the outbound C&Js and Lehigh Valleys would match in with the cars left on the main previously. C&Js would be going against C&Js, Lehigh Valleys would be facing Lehigh Valleys. Cars could be on either side of the locomotive. Sometimes not everything would fall into place and the locomotive might have to hold on to any car that the crew couldn't manage to drop. Any of these cars would be taken care of later when the train got back to the White Lab siding. The train would be put back together with the locomotive coming around the Y to get on the head end of the train and continue eastbound across Route 22. The only thing that would normally make the train stop at this point would be an empty car from Continental Packaging, or occasionally a car would come in for them off the EL. So this picture Walt took of an assembled eastbound train of 16 cars at Branch Junction. The crew has also just picked up 2 outbound loads of scrap from the Newark Iron siding at the left. This is the siding that was always submerged underwater, so the crew had to be careful not to roll the cars off the end. The train would come down Tin Kettle Hill and stop at the office at Kenilworth. The crew would exchange paperwork with the office and any waybills for overhead cars in the EL would be stamped. After that, the train would continue on to the White Lab siding where the outbound LV and C&J cars from the Rahway River branch had been stashed earlier in the day. Whichever was easiest or pre-planned, the crew would head to the Lehigh Valley or C&J first with their outbound cars and leave the other cars on the main. Usually the Lehigh Valley cars were dropped off first because they had the fewest amount of cars to go out. Usually the Rahway Valley would have about 5 or 6 cars or better to set out for the valley. If the train had more than 3 cars, they would pull up the long track and the locomotive cut off. This shot shows number 16 heading into the interchange with 4 outbounds. The 2 Buffalo Creek box cars are empties coming back from Levinson and Union after delivering carloads of flour. The 2 hopper cars are empty plastic cars from Monsanto. The locomotive would run around on the other adjacent track. If there were 3 cars or less, they'd pull up and shove them back into the pocket, clear of the team track switch. The conductor would drop off the paperwork down at the east end when the agent was still in the station in a waybill box, or when the agent was still in the station. Later on, when the agent relocated to the little concrete building alongside the team track, there was a box on a post where the paperwork would be left. The locomotive would run light back to the junction switch, get the outbound C&J cars, and make their drop off for the C&J at Aldine. Most of the time, the Cranford drill was tied up already, so the RV crew didn't have to worry. They would spot a clear track, run up, cut off, and run back down the next clear track. Usually there were 2 clear tracks in the yard. Paperwork for the outbound cars was stuffed in the phone box attached to the corner of the old roundhouse. If there was 1 clear track, then the crew would go to the west end and eyeball which track had the least amount of cars. They'd look in the phone box and do some figuring. Don't move that track, don't bury that track, and finally figure out which track to double over onto and shove their cars in and run back on the clear track. When there was an outbound car from Crossfield that had to go to the C&J, the crew would drop their cut in the yard and go back to Crossfield, grab the car, and shove it up against the cars they had just dropped. The locomotive would head back light to Kenilworth from the C&J after having made the last setouts. Usually by this time, especially in the colder months, it would already be past dark. The crew had electric and kerosene hand lanterns. They never used fusees unless they stole some off one of the neighboring railroads and used them occasionally. George Clark never provided any fusees or gloves. The crew would pick those off the customers while drilling their sidings if they were lucky. Otherwise, they'd have to buy their own gloves. After that, the locomotive would come back light to Kenilworth and the crew would put it away in the engine house. That would usually conclude a 10 or 12-hour day, with the crew tying up in Kenilworth about 7 or 9 p.m. every day. Sometimes, due to derailment or some other circumstance, the train would be brought in at 15 hours, midnight, before making setouts at the 2 lower interchanges. They would get to the office and George Clark would come out to say, tie the cars down on the main and put the engine away and make those outbound setouts first thing in the morning. Frote and the brakeman would put the locomotive back in the engine house, kick the pans back underneath, crank the handbrake on and turn the lights out and drop the door. Switz would head into the office as the rest of the crew would get in their cars and leave. Switz would sit at the bay window in the office and finish the time slip, do the wheel reports, and he'd add 20 minutes onto his time for filling out the report and sort the paperwork he had to leave. Sometimes Clark would come out and chat, but usually he was in his apartment in the next room watching TV. And that concluded a day on the Rahway Valley Railroad. I certainly hope everyone enjoyed the presentation and stuck with us. I'd like to thank the contributors whose photographs and information appeared in this presentation. Walt Appel, Paul Carpenito, Corinne Clark, Gene Graber, Steve Hepler, Rich John, Jeff Jardish, William Madden, Dan McFadden, John Nolan, Rich Panisi, Tom Reynolds, Bill Strassner, the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, Rich Taylor, Bob Wilt, Bill Young, Rich Zimaszewski, and Victor Zielinski. So thank you all for your many generous contributions. I think they illustrated this very well. So my last slide is, I'm just going to open it up to questions. So Mike Kaplonsky, if there are any questions in the Q&A block or in the chat window, I'm happy to answer them, or maybe someone else would be interested in answering them.
All right, so we got a number of compliments in the chat window here. There is a, well, let's see, one question from Rudy Garbly asking about the RV handling LCL post 1951. Obviously referring to the famous photo of all the boxes piled up on the pilot of the steam engine.
Thank you.
And that's all I see in the way of questions right now. I think Paul Carpenito made a couple points earlier about some of the photographs, which we can speak to him about offline. I don't know if you have anything to add about the LCL.
So basically the less than carload shipments basically fell off after the late 50s, early 60s. So those pictures that you see with packages on the pilot of the steam engine were mainly prior to then.
Was the Newark Heights branch severed when Route 78 was built?
Yes, so the Newark Heights branch was severed right behind the Hollywood Memorial Park in about 1973 when Route 78 came through. So basically what the deal was there is the state came through and said the Rahway Valley would have to kick in money for a bridge over the highway if they wanted to keep their track in. So at that time, really, there were only two customers, Kingston Coal, which was on its way out, and Maplewood Building Specialties, which only shipped cars every few months. So there just wasn't really any justification for keeping the track in. So it was cut in 1973.
Is any of the track still there?
Yes, there's quite a bit of track still there. The railroad was abandoned in 1992. Most of the branches were torn up. The main line right away is intact, albeit encroached upon in several locations. And as many people know, in the early 2000s, Union County did try to rebuild a portion of the railroad. So some of the track was relayed in portions. But that's basically how it stands today.
And what were some of the last customers on the line before they closed up?
So the last customers on the railroad before they closed up were during the Susquehanna era in the 90s. They were Christie Enterprises, which was a late customer in Kenilworth. They got carloads of plastic. Jaeger Lumber and Industrial Plywood in Union were among the last customers. But the real death knell for the railroad was when Monsanto Corporation in Kenilworth closed in 1989. That was the last biggest customer on the railroad, and after that, it just kind of fell apart.
So I think that actually answered two people's questions. One, I'm not sure if that answers your question as well. Also, what happened to the proposal to resurrect the railroad a few years ago?
So the railroad was started rebuilding. Basically, the property is owned by New Jersey Department of Transportation. They bought it from Delaware Sego, which owns the Susquehanna, in 1995. Union County stepped in to reactivate the railroad for freight service. The Morristown and Erie was contracted to rebuild the railroad, and there were state allocated funds to do that. The Morristown and Erie was just a contractor. So basically, the funding for that was inadequate when they started and quickly dried up. And that was right before the housing market fell out in 2008. So after that happened, the funds just never appeared, and the project was and still is abandoned.
Okay, two related questions. When did service end to Scheibel Oil and to Woolly Fuel?
Woolly Fuel discontinued shipments in 1957, I believe. I have some letters going back and forth between Woolly Fuel and the Rahway Valley. Basically, George Clark complaining that they weren't shipping any more coal. Scheibel Oil, I'm not entirely sure when they discontinued shipments. Scheibel Oil itself is, I think, there until the 90s. It's now the site of the Springfield Fire Department. But I would say sometime in the 70s, they discontinued car loadings, if I had to guess.
And can you speak a little bit about the Summit Parkline project? Sure.
I'm actually involved a little bit with the Summit Parkline project, as is the Tri-State Railway Historical Society. So since the reactivation of the project is basically a moot point now, basically several folks in Summit stepped in to basically rail bank the line and turn it into a hiking trail between Summit and Bryant Lake Park in Springfield. So there are a bunch of individuals involved in that project, and they're receiving grants to put in some of the bridges back in as pedestrian bridges. So the first segment between Morris Avenue and Broad Street is now in, and they're working towards Bryant Lake. I became involved in Tri-State by extension with the park line. So this was a great opportunity to do some historical interpretation. So in the next couple months on the completed portion of the park line project, we will be installing interpretive signage along the Rahway Valley to help share some of the story of the railroad.
And a related question, is the right-of-way still intact from the rebuilding? Which I guess the answer is sort of mostly. You can talk in a little bit more detail.
I guess the answer is in theory, yes. The property is intact as a single parcel from Aldine all the way to Summit. The more complicated answer is the right-of-way has been encroached on in many locations, crossings paved over or ripped out. So if the project was to restart, there would be a lot of work involved in, removing asphalt that went over the tracks and things like that.
The easement through the Carter Bell property has expired too, and has reverted back to the Carter Bell successors as well.
Right.
So there's actually a break in the right of way that really can't necessarily be recovered or reconnected without great
Right.
expenditures of money to its new owners.
Right.
Will volume 2 be reprinted anytime?
So I reprinted volume 1 as an expanded second edition. I'm working on a volume 3 right now. So volume 3 will deal with facilities, industries, and operations. And I'm working on that book with Walt Switz and Tom Piccirillo, who has provided a lot of illustrations of buildings and such. That book should be coming out hopefully in the new year, shortly into the new year. So after that, I hope to go back and revisit volume 2 for a reissue.
Can you speak a little bit about the status of the RV 70 tonners?
So the Rahway Valley 70 tonners are owned by the Tri-State Railway Historical Society, of which I am treasurer, and this is the Tri-State meeting. So the Rahway Valley 70 tonners are stored in the URHS yard in Boonton, New Jersey. They are currently inoperable, but stored and preserved. We actually just completed a very substantial project on Rahway Valley 16 that took quite a bit of time and a lot of efforts on the parts of many people. Most of the biggest effort was John Nolan's assistance with that. So basically in the 90s, when the locomotives were donated from or acquired by the URHS from the Susquehanna, I might not have all the details correct, so please bear with me. The locomotives were moved from the Susquehanna to the MMC without anyone checking the journals. And number 16 developed a hot box or several hot boxes and scored several of the axle ends. And that damage has remained until this year. So when we acquired the locomotives, the first priority was to get number 16 repaired. So John Nolan was very generous and traveled down to Texas, where we located a set of 70-tonner trucks, which were disassembled, the wheel sets loaded onto a flatbed trailer and brought to New Jersey. Thereafter, John trucked them to a wheel repair shop in Pennsylvania, and Tri-State, with the assistance of Liberty Historical Railway, funding from those folks, were able to retrue the wheels. The wheels were then brought to the Morristown or Erie shop in Morristown, and the folks at the A&E, Greg Dodd and Matt Fallon and others, swapped the wheel sets under the locomotive and made it mobile again. So then the M&E, with Rich Campana, Matt Fallon, and Pete Bransky, brought the engine up to Boonton this past June, where it's now stored. Long-term plans call for evaluating the locomotives, seeing if there's any potential or feasibility for restoring one or both to operation. But at the very least, they will be continued to be preserved under our care, and preserved for future generations.
And our very long time member Bob Bars is asking about you finding anything more on the Lackawanna getting their fuel via the RV at Summit.
I have not found anything additionally in any paperwork. I will be sure to reach out to you, Bob, if I do. Basically, the only indications I had that happened were I basically acquired a bunch of diaries from Bill Young a number of years ago. And he just mentions that the fuel oil was moved over the Rahway Valley. So I haven't found any paperwork beyond that, but if I do, I'll be sure to send it to you.
Can you do another not safe for work presentation based exclusively on George Clark's correspondence? And another gentleman who is curious about what type of rail is mainly found on the Rahway Valley and what the county used in their rebuild and whether that was consistent or improved.
Okay. So basically, regarding George Clark, most of his correspondence between friends of his is rated NSC 17. So we need a disclaimer. The second question is about the rail. The Rahway Valley was mostly laid with 70-pound rail, which was very light even in the era that the Rahway Valley operated in, which relegated the Rahway Valley to the 70 tonners, which it had, and nothing heavier. When the railroad was rebuilt, it was done with the idea that, Morristown and Erie numbers 18 and 19, well over 100 tons would be running over that track. So I don't quote me on this, but I believe the track was 130 pounds, if not heavier. On the portions of the track that were relayed, you can see the substantial size difference in the rail between the parts of the track that are still there and still original 70-pound.
All right, and there were a couple of hands up that have been up for quite a while. I just lowered them. If anybody still has a question, if you raise your hand again, I will enable your audio and you can ask your question if you are unable to type it. At the bottom of your screen, a little toolbar will appear. You can click raise hand and I'll be able to see that. And I don't see any hands going up. Okay.
Did you check the Q&A box too?
I did, actually. That's where most of this was coming from.
Oh, okay.
One other question. When was the last train?
April of 1992.
Were you born then?
I was not. It was nearly 2 years to the day before I graced the world.
Very nice. I see no further questions.
Okay.
Vecchio, if you're still out there somewhere, do you want to play us out of the church?
Okay, well, that was a great show, Rich. Very informative. The Rahway Valley, Monsanto closed in 1989. In 1988, Rahway Valley played a part in the NRHS convention that Tri-State hosted that year. We staged night shots there, and that shared the railroad with a bunch of people. So the rail was laid. The new rail that replaced the old rail was generally 130, 131, and there was some 115. It was all of it was relay. I don't think some new rail went in, but a lot of it was relay, but was to upgrade it, as Richie said. That was I was with the Morristown and Erie when that project was happening. So, and new ties. Mostly what Morristown and Erie did was relay the Y next to Route 22. The theory was it'd start there, and then the county there would be funding available to extend out from there, since it didn't connect to anything. But that was Gordon guessed wrong. That money came, and no money came after that. Some money went into the CERT at Bayway, and that was it. So, Richie, that was a tremendous show. I know the effort that went into putting that together, and thank you very much. It was a big effort. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for attending.
And thank you, Walt Switz.
And thank you, Walt Switz. Walt, when I started on the M&E, Walt was the conductor that beat me into shape, and it was a lot of fun, and I could as Walt was referring to the people that trained him, I could see Walt, interesting. If Walt's watching, thank you, Walt.
For the 55 or so people who hung on here, I'll let you have a glimpse.
I'm still here, Mike. You better straighten out.
Hey, Bird. Hey, Walt. Glad
Yes.
you made it, Walt. You're a great contribution. I had no idea you were that involved in the Rahway Valley. I remember your stories.
Yeah. He was pretty close to relaying exactly what I told him. There are a couple of things I'll have to beat him up in the back room later, but otherwise he did an excellent job, I think.
I think so too. And it's funny, listening to the way and watching the way you were switching that Y, you brought all that to Bayway, because we did a lot of that same type of move and that same kind of thinking,
Oh yeah.
and we still do it today.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's the thing. I mean, there's some moves that just don't go out of style. But unless
It's all common sense, I think someone once said.
yeah, common sense, sure. Oh, it was tough, but we made it.
Yep.
All right. I'm gonna turn the big seat over to the big boy here because he owns the joint. So
There you go. Great
Nice
to see you,
chat.
Walt.
nice
Thank
chat.
you, Walt.
All right. Bunch of thank yous and applauses and congratulations, Rich, from our audience here. And I guess that about does it.
And
All
we'll
right.
see everybody next month. All the best of the holidays, whichever holidays you celebrate. And thank you again. Return your ballots, return your dues, etc. And if you're not a member, please join. We'd love to share rareting with you. So
Thank you all.
Everybody.